Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 11:21. Since light color Merskaghan didn't gain his long lifespan from his Beyonder characteristic, Klein could only begin considering external factors. The effects of a mystical item? No, he doesn't have any mystical items on him. Aside from the Giant King's residence, there's nothing in the vicinity either. However, that's the sleeping ground of Dark Angel Sasria. Furthermore, the key is with me. I don't think Merskaghan would dare or have the means to enter. Who took the key to the Giant King's residence after Sasria fell into a slumber? Isn't that a bit too wicked? Of course, the palace without the powers of a deity augmenting it wouldn't be able to trap a king of angels. Or perhaps, this key had long been transported to the northern continent during the migration of the giants. Sasria chose to sleep in the palace because, other than a small number of existences, no one can open the door and affect his sleep. Was Vice Admiral Iceberg's key given to me through a roundabout manner by the god of knowledge and wisdom? He wants to learn of Sasria's present state? If it's not the effects of a mystical item, what could it be? Time given by an angel from the Marauder pathway? Ignoring the possibility of giving stolen illusory items to someone else, there needs to be an angel or a Grade 0 sealed artifact from the Marauder pathway. And there aren't any similar existences nearby. Back then, Merskaghan was given a lifespan of thousands of years at once. Perhaps only Amorn is capable of doing that. Clearly, he wouldn't help Dark Angel Sasria. In addition, this blasphemer's true body seems to be wandering around the forsaken land of the gods. If there were angels or Grade 0 sealed artifacts of the Marauder pathway here, they might have become his food long ago. The cycle of fate? After light color Merskaghan's natural death, everything begins with him guarding Sasria again? Yes, that's possible. If the current Merskaghan is in an aged state, then it's completely understandable how so much time has passed. Furthermore, because the time in this loop seals centuries, it hasn't reached a node yet. It's only normal that I didn't manage to discover any signs above the grey fog in my haste. With this in mind, he quickly observed his surroundings to find traces of the Angel of Fate, Ouroboros. However, there was no remnant power like that. Klein quickly retracted his gaze and continued to observe light color Merskaghan's intense battle with Colin Iliad and the silver-armored knight Evil Spirit. His spirit body threads are normal, eliminating the possibility of him already becoming a marionette. Under true vision, his condition isn't abnormal. This means that he isn't a figure summoned from history. The divine kingdom of the Giant King's court is slowing down the passing of time or aging. The former can be eliminated because my spirituality is almost unable to support my level of observation. This matches the amount of time the City of Silver's exploration team has spent in this area. There is a certain chance of the latter, with life progressing in the sunset state but being solidified during dusk. But the problem is that the ancient god, the Giant King, has already perished. Badheil, who wields the power of dawn and the power of dusk, has brought the divine kingdom to the astral world. It's impossible for this king's court to still have such a powerful influence remaining within it. Klein went through all the possibilities of extending one's life that he could think of, but none of them matched the situation of the leader of the court chasers. He had no choice but to consider another possibility. A secret art with a huge defect. This should be dependent on some kind of power in the Giant King's court. Otherwise, the range of Merskaghan's activities wouldn't be so tiny. It wouldn't take until the City of Silver's expedition team arrived at Carrot Residence before he took action. The entity related to life inside the Giant King's court clearly exists, the former goddess of harvest, the present Earth Mother, Giant Queen Omabella. As this thought flashed through his mind, he cast his gaze at the giant statues outside the palace. They were no different from the ones the City of Silver expedition team had encountered along the way. They were only slightly larger. However, after careful inspection, he noticed a small number of abnormalities. These giant statues had the aura of life, and they possessed a certain amount of spirituality. However, behind the mask, it was pitch black without any dark red glow. This light color Merskaghan had used some sort of secret technique in the life domain to bind his spirit with the living statues. Using them, he obtained a long life, but this results in him being limited to such a tiny region and being unable to leave. This is very similar to the way evil spirits exist. This way, Muskegon might not be able to show his normal mythical creature form. Klein conjured a gold coin and flipped it up to make confirmation. When he received an affirmation, he raised the sea god scepter high and prepared to remind Little Sun through the prayer light. At this moment, Demon Hunter Colin, who had avoided Muskegon's first attack, suddenly ducked and circled around him, running straight for the Giant King's residence from the side. His gaze was locked onto those gigantic statues. In the intense battle just now, although this city of Silver Chief had always been at a disadvantage, he didn't give up on observing his surroundings, nor did he stop thinking. He was similarly puzzled as to why the leader of the court chasers could live for thousands of years. When he discovered that the living giant statues were only standing outside the palace without participating in the battle, he had arrived at a certain conclusion. He didn't know what exactly was going on, what principles underlay it, or what domain it belonged to, but his rich experience in exploration, and the intuition as a demon hunter, made him believe that the statues were the crux of the problem. Tap! 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 With two swords in his hands, Colin Iliad dashed forward, taking large strides. However, he didn't run in a straight line as he zigzagged his way forward. Upon seeing this scene, Light Color Muskegon let out an angry roar as he held the broadsword in his hands and rapidly slashed forward. His reaction proved that Colin Iliad's judgment was correct. Bang! 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 Demon Hunter Colin suddenly leaped away and did a roll. And above his original trajectory, silver light appeared out of thin air and exploded, forming a long snake. It completely lifted the solid ground of the king's court, tearing open a deep chasm. With a loud thud, Light Color Muskegon took a step forward. His nearly 5-meter-tall body bent and smashed the silver broadsword in his hand onto the ground. Clang! The area shook violently as the pillars snapped and fell into the orange cloud beneath. The ground between the two buildings exploded layer by layer, sending countless gravel flying. As for Demon Hunter Colin, he had already leaped up ahead of time and was in midair. He crossed his swords, creating an invisible barrier that blocked the rubble that resembled an arrow. Most up-to-date novels are published on n0velbgn.co/m. At this moment, Muskegon, who had his back bent his knee and exerted strength into it. His massive body shot out like a meteor, instantly closing the distance between him and Demon Hunter Colin. During this process, the silver broadsword in his hand moved upwards. Seeing that Demon Hunter Colin was no longer able to dodge, a bright light suddenly shot over, accurately hitting Muskegon's broadsword. With a loud clang, Colin Iliad tumbled to the ground and finally approached the giant statues in one swift move. At the same time, he saw from the corner of his eye that the silver-armored Knight Phantom in front of Elder Lovia had long drawn out its giant sword. It had condensed the light of dawn into a huge bow as it shot out arrows consecutively. Light Color Muskegon's single eye had already been dyed with a layer of red. He didn't care about the arrows of light, and he allowed them to hit his body as they produced clanking sounds. He kept charging forward and brandished his broadsword, causing silver light to appear from different parts of the void. He chased after the giant like Demon Hunter Colin, preventing him from attacking those giant statues. Suddenly, an arrow that was gathered from the lustrous brilliances tore past Muskegon and silently hit the gap in his visor. This was from the evil spirit that Shepherd Lovia grazed. Demon Hunter Colin was merely bait. It was the real attacker. Swoosh! 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 One arrow after another flew past, but this time, they were all blocked by Muskegon. But at that moment, the demon hunter had already positioned himself well. He aimed at the remaining giant statues and swung his two straight swords that were enveloped by the light of dawn. Light bloomed as a hurricane of light blanketed the area. With continuous cracking sounds, the statues collapsed to the ground. Meanwhile, the aura of the Light Color Muskegon rapidly declined. This King's Court Chaser leader immediately roared, "Let's die together!" The silver broadsword in his hand exploded, splintering into countless fragments of light. They formed a terrifying storm that swept everything around them. the silver-armored knight Evil Spirit and demon hunter Colin simultaneously stabbed their swords into the ground, creating an invisible barrier. The dazzling white light swept between the two buildings, destroying the greyish-blue door and stone pillars behind Derek and company. However, when they swept into the Giant King's residence, they failed to affect it completely. After an unknown period of time, just as Derek thought that the invisible barrier was about to be torn apart by the hurricane of light, the rays of light finally dimmed. In the ruins, the silver armor on the body of light-color Merskagan slowly faded away, revealing his grayish-blue body that was wearing linen clothes. Not far away from him, demon hunter Colin's body was covered in blood. He was transforming from a giant back to his normal state, but his aura was relatively stable. It was just that he had weakened greatly. With a clang, Merskagan genuflected as his flesh rapidly aged, decomposed, and evaporated. Under the orange light, he seemed to see the lively King's Court once again. In the frozen dusk, giants came and went, playing the seven-stringed guitar or bone flute, wrestling, or enjoying the delicacies that they could eat at any time. The passing of their lives moved extremely slowly, and their king sat on a high throne, watching everything from above with a stately demeanor. After that incident, none of that existed, so he chose to follow Dark Angel Sasria. A smile appeared on Merskagan's face as he opened his mouth and softly shouted, "King." This court chaser bowed his head, his flesh and blood completely evaporated, leaving behind a huge white skeleton and silvery white light that had condensed together. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 11:22. Above the grey fog, when Klein saw light-color Merskagan rapidly age and decompose into bones, he suddenly recalled Mobert, Syatas, Frunzia, and Snowman when they left Grozel's travels. He didn't have the time to stop it back then, and it was no different this time. This was because the leader of the King's Court chasers had never chanted the honorific name of the Fool, so he was unable to pull him above the grey fog. However, compared to before, with the Sea God scepter in hand, he could now do more things by using the prayer light. He immediately accommodated the Black Emperor card and activated the powers of the mysterious space above the grey fog. He made the paper angel carry his own words and use the Crimson Star to enter the real world and land on the remnant spirit of light-color Merskagan. This was one of the methods that wouldn't lower his loftiness as the Fool. After all, the true creator was still watching the area. As Merskagan's consciousness was rapidly wiped out of existence, an angel with black wings suddenly appeared in front of him. The speed at which his spirit body collapsed slowed down as he heard a loud and majestic voice. "What is the advancement ritual and supplementary ingredients of the Silver Night Potion? Is Sasria really sleeping in the palace of the Giant King?" Merskagan replied blankly, "The advancement ritual of the Silver Night comes from the blasphemy slate. It needs a complicated altar to be set up, placing the remains of the 6 powerful creatures one had hunted in the correct positions, and receive the blessings of a deity. The supplementary ingredients are... I can't be certain." In short, that door didn't open after Lord Sasria entered. Amidst the response, the spirit of Merskagan's spirit slowly but firmly dissipated. Finally, he could no longer hold on as he was reduced to points of light that merged into the still dusk of the Giant King's Court. And this conversation happened within the soul domain, so no one else could hear it. Thankfully, I'm careful enough to not let Merskagan say the main ingredient of the Silver Night Potion. Anyway, the Beyonder characteristic can be used to replace whatever it is. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to hear the answer to the second question. The Fool heaved a sigh of relief and praised himself inwardly. He then focused and seriously thought about what Merskagan had just said. A deity's blessing? Isn't this advancement ritual a little too difficult? It's only sequence 3. I have to consider the circumstances of his timeline. Merskagan is a powerhouse who survived from the Second Epoch. It was a habit to call an angel a subsidiary god, and include them in the ranks of a god. That also means that the blessings of an angel should be sufficient. Yes, I'll use divination to confirm this later. Of course, even if an angel's blessings are sufficient, I'm unable to do anything for the time being. It will depend if the Grade 0 sealed artifacts in the City of Silver have any living characteristics that can also be communicated with. The act of setting up that altar is actually a little complicated. Must the remains of the 6 powerful creatures that one has personally killed have to be at the demigod level? It's very difficult for demon hunters outside the forsaken land of the gods. How can there be so many demigod-level creatures to be killed? Most of them are protected by their corresponding organizations. From the looks of it, the Church of the God of Combat should have a new substitute method while maintaining the essence of the ritual. Is this the difference between the first and second blasphemy slate? However, for a young chief like the City of Silver, he must have killed more than 6 powerful monsters. That's easy. Most up-to-date novels are published on n0velbn.co/m. As he was currently certain that the second blasphemy slate had appeared after the ancient sun god's death, he was able to determine that light color Merskagan was referring to the first blasphemy slate. He quickly conjured a piece of parchment from his interpretation of the advancement ritual and supplementary ingredients. Then, a divination with a topaz spirit pendulum was performed, to which he received a revelation that there were no mistakes. Then, he threw this message to the crimson star representing the sun. This is a gift from Mr. Fool. After doing all of this, Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. He increasingly felt that the answer to the second question was worth ruminating. He didn't say if Sasria was truly asleep. He only said that the door hadn't opened after the Dark Angel entered. And the only thing that didn't open was the door. The God of Knowledge and Wisdom gave me the key, and Adam gave me the unshadowed crucifix. Was it done to open the door to confirm the Dark Angel's condition? As his thoughts raced, he suddenly felt lucky. Fortunately, the true creator wasn't too interested in this. If this entity had sent down his will just now and tried to influence Merskagan's dissipating spirit, he would have clashed with the Fool's paper angel on the spot. That would be rather awkward. Only at that moment did Derek dare to open his eyes. His face was pale from having lost too much blood. In order to maintain the unshadowed domain, he had allowed the cross to absorb quite a bit of his blood. He looked around and placed the unshadowed crucifix in front of him as he sincerely thanked Mr. Fool. At that moment, Chaim put away Thunder God's roar and his weapon. He removed the leather bag on his back and found a set of clothes to throw to the chief. To the City of Silver's exploration team, as long as they weren't wearing clothes and armor that were mystical items, it was inevitable that their clothes would suffer damage during battle. Therefore, they definitely prepared a few additional sets ahead of time. To them, the purpose of clothing covering their bodies was secondary. The most important thing was to leave space to store materials, ointments, and charms. Colin Iliad looked around vigilantly, but he didn't find anything unusual. He quickly put on his clothes and found one of the small metal bottles that had fallen all over the ground during the battle. He removed the lid and gulped it down. His face turned a little green as if he had been poisoned. However, his wounds and the signs of decline were improving. As for Lovia, she was no longer able to maintain the grazing of the silver-armored knight, and she placed it back inside her body. By the time Merskagan's Beyonder characteristic condensed into a silvery white luster that resembled a miniature sun or heart, it was put away by demon hunter Colin. This shepherd elder looked at the nearby palace with his grey eyes and said, "Chief, the path to the sea might very well be hidden there." Lovia paused for a moment before adding, "Perhaps there's another way to get to the other side of the sea." As Colin Iliad watched Derek, Chaim, and the others clean up the battlefield, pick up items, and deal with the mutilated corpse of Antona, he shook his head and said, "The Dark Angel is sleeping inside, and he is definitely a king of angels, one we are currently unable to resist. Even facing him will be very difficult. Let's head back first and inform everyone that we have seen the sea before making preparations for entry into the Giant King's palace." Lovia's silver-grey hair fluttered slightly as she wore a solemn expression. "But we don't know anything. We can't make any targeted preparations." After saying that, she fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "I have a suggestion. You, Derek, Chaim, and the others can head back first. I'll stay behind and attempt to enter the palace to gather useful information. I can fuse into the shadows and perhaps not disturb that Dark Angel. If I don't return, it means that the danger inside has exceeded the limits we can handle." When Lovia mentioned that she might die, her expression didn't change at all, as if she had long been prepared. Colin listened quietly and stared at her for a few seconds. No. We can't bear such risks. If you awaken the Dark Angel, he might leave the Giant King's court and attack the City of Silver, but we definitely won't be able to resist against him. Without waiting for Lovia's reply, Colin Iliad turned his head and looked at the other three members. Derek, what's your opinion? My opinion? Derek was somewhat at a loss. He nearly blurted the question back out. Hyam and the other Dawn Paladin were equally shocked. This was because this was an internal conflict among the six-member council. Colin Iliad had actually asked for Derek Berg's opinion. Could it be that the chief has been nurturing Derek as the next elder of the six-member council? The two members of the expedition team looked thoughtfully at their teammates. This is him asking for my opinion? The falk line above the grey fog frowned slightly. His brain immediately began to churn rapidly. What views can I have? If they were to open the door and awaken Sasria, I wouldn't be able to save any of them. All I can do is get them to ask for the help of the true creator. Let's wait until I figure out the situation regarding the Dark Angel from the Red Angel evil spirit and other related existences before beginning the exploration. I don't have to worry about the Dragon of Wisdom and Adam's thoughts for now. No matter what, there's nothing wrong with choosing to be calm and cautious at such times. As his thoughts raced, Klein sternly said, "Return." He then projected this image into the crimson star representing the sun. Derek was stunned for 2 seconds before calmly answering the chief's question. I think we should give up for now and wait until we're ready. Colin Iliad nodded and said to Shepherd Lovia, "This is my decision." Lovia fell silent for a moment before saying, "I will defer to your decision." She didn't say anything else as she helped Derek and company mark the area. As Anteona wasn't killed by a blood relative, there was a high possibility that an anomaly would happen. Therefore, the expedition team would mark the area, making the ones who arrived later to be more vigilant. However, they didn't need to worry about such effects since they were very far away from the City of Silver. While they busied themselves, Lovia suddenly looked up and said to Derek and Hyam, "This is the Giant King's court. There might not be any anomalies." She didn't explain as she looked at Anteona's pile of flesh that had been burned into ashes by the flames. She grabbed a handful of them and placed them inside her leather bag. After completing these matters, the City of Silver's expedition team found another passageway, but they obtained a disappointing outcome. Following that, under the lead of Chief Colin Iliad, they retraced their path back. After entering the palace that had already lost its main door while having the oil painting band playing their tunes, Derek couldn't help but turn his head to look outside at the broken railings again. He looked at the orange-red cloud in the distance, towards the deep blue sea. After staring at it for a few seconds, he retracted his gaze and realized that the chief's light blue eyes were also silently looking in that direction. Colin immediately turned his head and said calmly, "Let's go." Then, without turning back, he proceeded steadily. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 11:23. Above the grey fog, when he saw that the City of Silver's exploration team had begun embarking on their way back as the Giant King's palace remained unchanged, Klein heaved a sigh of relief and leaned back in his chair, exhausted. After 2 hours of observation, his spirituality was nearing its limits. At most, he could hold out for another 15 minutes. Regardless, the things obtained from this expedition completely exceeded my imagination. It's only right to give the Silver Night potion formula to the City of Silver. As he rubbed his forehead, his thoughts began to wander. Being aware of these ancient secrets is very helpful to my digestion after my advancement. The problem now is that my Bizarro Sorcerer potion hasn't been fully digested. From the feedback I've been getting over this period of time, it can be seen that all sorts of strange tales are indeed useful. When Miss Magician completes the script and publishes it, it just needs some time to build up some momentum before it's done. However, she started writing a few days ago. I don't know when she will finish her manuscript. Why can't she just write a few more hours every day? When I went to pick her up this time, I should urge her. With this in mind, Klein suddenly recalled something. He hadn't given Anderson a reward for finding Vice Admiral Ailment. I'll wait until he helps Danitz become a conspirer. Anyway, this was also part of the agreement. The advancement ritual of an iron-blooded knight isn't difficult, but it's not simple either. Especially for a hunter, it's even more troublesome. It requires a hunter who is adept at provocation and enjoys coming up with ploys to build a team of at least 30 people, and also nurture a deep sense of friendship amongst them while making them strong. When they act almost as one, they'll set up the ritual. The greater the strength and camaraderie amongst the team, the better the effects of the ritual. Seeing that the City of Silver's expedition team was returning in an orderly manner without encountering any accidents, he finally felt at ease. He left the world above the grey fog and threw himself into bed, falling into a dream. After some rest at the afternoon town camp, Derek Berg finally recovered and his face was no longer as pale. He had just eaten bread made from black-faced grass powder when a figure grew out from the shadows outside and said in a low voice, "Derek, the chief is looking for you." "Yes." Derek subconsciously stood up. "Thank you." He was originally prepared to find the chief and hand over the Silver Knight potion formula. After watching the messenger retreat into the shadows, he walked out of the room and arrived at the clearing where the bonfire was illuminated. At a glance, Derek saw many members who hadn't participated in the expedition gathered in groups of 2 or 3. They were excitedly discussing something. They already knew that one could see the sea from the Giant King's court. They knew that it wasn't too far from the coast, and as long as they found the correct path, they would arrive there in no time. This was an important step for the City of Silver to save themselves after discovering the outsider, Jack. The residents of the City of Silver, who mainly had the power of dawn, finally saw the light of dawn. Their long wait and persistence seemed to have paid off. Derek could understand the feelings of his team members because he was the same. However, from the world German Sparrow, he knew very well that the waters in the ruins of the Battle of Gods weren't that simple. To head to the other side of the sea would probably be extremely difficult. Ignoring everything else, just Archangel Sasria, who was sleeping in the Giant King's palace and blocking the vital path outside, was a problem that he couldn't overcome at the moment. "I can only hope that Mr. Fool will bless me." Yes, for that boy to appear in the temple ruins, it means that there are other paths that can bypass the Giant King's palace and reach the sea. Derek thought optimistically as he circled around the quietly burning bonfire and walked towards the chief's room on the other side. Suddenly, he saw a person sitting silently in the shadow of a boulder. It was a man in his 20s, and he was much taller than Derek. He held a pale gold bracelet with 3 small bells hanging on it as he looked at it with his pupils unfocused. Derek was no stranger to this man. He knew that he was the husband of Antiona, Dolores, a Sequent 6 Dawn Paladin. Most up-to-date novels are published on n0velbgn.co/m. In the City of Silver, before the age of 18, one could date freely until they were married. And if one didn't have a partner at the age of 18, they would be arranged to have one. It was the same for widows and widowers after 3 years. This was a necessary measure to ensure the necessary population level for the City of Silver's continuation. It seemed like it was against human rights, but for the continuation of the entire city in the Dark Lands, it could only be done this way. Furthermore, this could ensure that everyone had a certain number of close relatives, preventing the possibility of mutating into a terrifying evil spirit after their death. As for Dolores and Antiona, they were neighbors who lived on the same street. They had known each other since they were young and had a good impression of each other. In the end, they started dating when they were teammates of a patrol team. Over time, they became husband and wife and had a deep, loving relationship. In light of how they had a young child, Colin Illid had deliberately left one of them behind during the expedition to the Giant King's court. On the one hand, Derek felt that there was nothing wrong with the chief's arrangement, and on the other hand, he felt a strong sense of sorrow because of the way Dolores acted. It was as if he had returned to the state when he had to personally stab his parents to death. From the beginning to the end of the expedition, it only took half a day's time. However, to Dolores, it meant everything had changed. After a moment of silence, Derek retracted his gaze and continued forward, subconsciously taking a few heavy steps. At the same time, he thought of a rumor. Shepherd Elder Lovia once had a husband, but he died in an expedition. This was very common to begin with and wasn't worth discussing. However, other than Lovia, the team that explored the ruins of the temple had all gone mad. After they were eradicated, there were rumors that gradually spread among the residents of the City of Silver. During that expedition, Elder Lovia had eaten her husband. In the night with low lightning frequency, the winds were rather cold. Derek shivered and turned his attention back to the scene before him. He took a few steps and arrived at his destination. He raised his hand and knocked on the chief's door. "Come in," Colin Iliad said calmly. Derek pushed open the door and entered. He saw the chief wearing a linen shirt and dark-colored coat, wiping his two swords with oil. Colin Iliad didn't stop. He raised his head and looked at Derek. "What are your thoughts on this expedition? What's the chief's motive for asking this?" Having been influenced by Alger, Derek subconsciously had this thought. Unable to grasp the true intentions of the chief, he had no choice but to close the door and answer frankly, there might be other paths to the seaside. The palace of the Giant King should be very important, but that's too dangerous. We need more information. Colin Iliad nodded and asked, "The kings of angels and other existences who call themselves deities secretly plotted together because they wanted to resist the Lord? And did their success cause this land to be forsaken?" Although Derek had never directly heard of such an inference, it wasn't difficult to come up with a similar conclusion based on the various secrets he had learned from the Tarot Club. Yes, that should be the case. Colin fell silent. Even his act of wiping his sword slowed down. After a few seconds, he put down the items in his hand and took 2 steps forward. Those who participated in the conspiracy are still active on the other side of the sea. After a moment of silence, Derek replied in deliberation, "Mostly. But not too much." Colin Iliad nodded, indicating that he had nothing else to ask. Derek hurriedly said, "Chief, I obtained the incomplete formula of the Silver Night Potion, including the supplementary ingredients and the advancement ritual during Light-Color Merskagan's death." When he said this, Derek knew that his lie sounded overly fake. It could be seen through right away because he didn't even dare to open his eyes back then. However, he just couldn't think of a better excuse. If Mr. Hanged Man were here, he would definitely have a better solution. Just as this thought came to his mind, he heard the chief speak slowly. "Very good. What is it?" Derek was stunned for a second before he hurriedly recounted the corresponding ritual and supplementary ingredients. Colin listened quietly and let out a long sigh. "You have contributed greatly this time. This is extremely important to the City of Silver. In the future, our limit will be Sequence 3 and not Sequence 4. Up to a certain range, the risk of the expedition teams will be greatly reduced." Why will the risk encountered by the expedition teams be reduced when the upper limit is Sequence 3 within a certain range? As Derek was happy that he had made such a contribution, he couldn't understand the chief's words. However, he knew that this was something he didn't have the right to understand. He planned on asking around at the tarot gathering later. He then bade farewell and opened the door. "Derek!" Colin Iliad suddenly called out to him. Derek turned his head in puzzlement and found that the chief's expression was rather solemn. Colin fell silent for a while before shaking his head. "Be careful of Lovia." "Yes, Your Excellency," Derek replied from the bottom of his heart. Backland, North Borough. Hazel took a carriage back to the city from Moose Manor, and she was preparing to meet Miss Audrey at the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation to discuss matters regarding donations and help. After many interactions, she had a very good impression of this noble lady. She didn't feel pressured when beside her, and the strange emotions accumulated in her heart had mostly dissipated. She gradually recovered more of her forgotten memories. "I should have a teacher? What exactly happened that day? Every time I think about it, I tremble all over." Hazel cast her gaze out the window, feeling a little depressed. Her carriage was driving past the vicinity of Bock-Lund Street. At this moment, a person dressed in the clothes of a mailman rode his bicycle horizontally across the carriage, looking rather relaxed. Hazel casually sized him up and saw a monocle on his right eye. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 11:24. Hazel's gaze instantly froze as she felt something rapidly expanding in her mind. It was about to tear apart an invisible barrier and spew out. She instinctively looked away and curled up slightly. Then, she felt a ray of light shoot out from the depths of her heart, exploding into countless memory fragments in her mind as it howled, raging back and forth. She suddenly remembered what had happened at home that day. She recalled her father, mother, maid, and servants wearing monocles or pinching their eye sockets. The indescribable horror was so vivid, as though it had been carved into her bones. The expression on Hazel's face crumbled as she curled into a ball as she trembled. The maidservant in the carriage was stunned as she hurriedly stood up and reached out her hands in an attempt to help her up. "No!" Hazel trembled as she shouted with a nearly sharp voice. The maidservant was shocked and frightened. She stood rooted to the ground, not knowing how to react. After shouting, Hazel calmed down. She sat up and looked ahead in extreme fear. She saw the monocled postman enter another street, leaving only his back visible. "I wasn't feeling well just now." "I'm feeling much better now," Hazel turned her head and barely said to the maidservant. She realized that she wasn't as afraid as she remembered. It was as if she had already gotten used to the situation after some time. "If not, I might have lost control just now." Why would I use the word lose control? Thankfully, I forgot those memories and didn't do anything eye-catching when I saw the postman. It took me 10 seconds to break down. If not, I might have been detected, and something terrifying might have happened. Her thoughts flashed uncontrollably as her body trembled slightly. "Miss, do you need to go to the clinic?" the maidservant asked hurriedly. Hazel instinctively shook her head as her mind turned chaotic as she casually said, "Let's go to the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation first. I remember there's a private clinic nearby." "All right." The maidservant turned around and instructed the coachman to speed up. Hazel kept taking deep breaths in an attempt to regulate her tense emotions, panic, and fear. It had to be said that it was somewhat effective. She seemed to have calmed down a little instead of breaking down immediately. At that moment, a sparrow had appeared above the carriage at some point in time. It squeezed its right eye and spat out a human language with almost no sound. "She seems to have some unnecessary misunderstanding about me. It looks like T had some interactions with her before. Ah, she's a resident of Lund Street. Interesting." Before long, the carriage arrived at Phelps Street. Seeing that the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation wasn't far away, Hazel suddenly said, "To the cathedral. Turn toward St. Samuel Cathedral first. I want to pray." She wanted to tell the bishops what had happened that day and what she saw today. In the gap of the carriage, a blackened moved its feeler on its right and whispered in a human voice, "Humans nowadays are really lacking in creativity. They go to cathedrals at the first sight of problems. I thought I would discover something if I followed her. Next time, I'll steal the cathedral in front of them." The most up-to-date novels are published on n0velbgn.co/m. As he spoke, the other feeler of the ant moved as well. Hazel immediately forgot what she had just said and what she had just recalled. She had forgotten that she had met a postman wearing a monocle. She got off the carriage at the entrance of the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation and headed in with her maidservant in tow. Clearly, her maidservant and her driver didn't remember the previous order. In the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation, Audrey welcomed Hazel and brought her new friend into the activities needed to help the injured soldiers at the front lines. As the World German Sparrow had mentioned that the leader of the secret order, Zaratul, and other angels were hidden in Backlund, Audrey carefully gave up on the third stage of treatment for Hazel. She hoped that Hazel wouldn't recall what she had experienced for the time being to prevent any accidents from happening. Her current plan was to busy herself with charity work, helping others to make Hazel gradually brighten up and strengthen her ability to withstand the psychological trauma. In the Pirates' Free City, Force was drinking a high concentration of fruit wine that was locally produced, recording what she had heard and encountered today. Suddenly, her spiritual perception was triggered as she instinctively looked to the side. She immediately saw a figure appear in the void, quickly reforming. It was German Sparrow in a half-top hat, black trench coat, and a cold expression. With a swoosh, Force stood up with her wine glass and fountain pen. She subconsciously said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Sparrow." As she spoke, she hurriedly placed the items on the table. Klein pressed his top hat and looked around. "Do you want to leave?" Force's eyes darted to her sides before she said, "All right." Over the past few days, she had already made preliminary records of the traits of the city that were different from other places. Without saying a word, Klein gestured at the items on the desk with his chin, indicating for Miss Magician to quickly pack up. Force didn't hesitate at all as she hurriedly organized her drafts as though she had heard an instruction. As he stood there and watched the other party busy, he suddenly said, "How's the progress with the horror story?" Force trembled indiscernibly before replying, "Soon, soon." Klein gently nodded his head. "How much longer?" "A week, no, 5 days. 5 days, tops," Force quickly replied. Klein didn't say anything else. After Force packed up her drafts, fountain pen, half a bottle of wine, and other memorabilia, he took 2 steps forward and grabbed her shoulder. Countless indescribable figures flashed past, and Force felt a little more relaxed than before. She even attempted to record this travel. Before long, she returned to Backland and returned to the alley where she had disappeared from before. She heard the World German Sparrow say, "Rest for a few days before setting off. Take note of any replies. Also, ask your teacher again if there's any information related to the Blood Emperor Tudor, mainly about the various ruins." "All right." Force quickly agreed and thanked him. After separating from German Sparrow, she returned to a street in East Borough and entered an apartment that she shared with Zio. Zio put down the newspaper and looked at her friend. "Was it effective?" "Pretty good. I went to a free city belonging to the pirates this time." Before Force could finish speaking, her expression changed slightly. "Give me my coffee beans and cigarettes." "Why? Was it lacking there?" Zio asked in puzzlement. Force ran straight for the room inside and sat in front of the desk. She opened her drafts and picked up a pen. Without looking back, she said, "For the sake of the new book, remember to make me coffee." Zio followed her to the bedroom door. When she heard that, she opened her mouth but didn't say anything. In another spot in East Borough, in a rented apartment with a similar layout. As Zaratul had already arrived in Backland, it was unknown when Amorn would be baited over. The Red Angel evil spirit's true motives were unknown, and he was planning on preventing George III from becoming a Black Emperor. On the one hand, Klein was trying his best to digest the Bizarro Sorcerer potion, and on the other hand, he was making various preparations. At this moment, after handling the magician, he opened up a piece of paper and wrote, "Dear Mr. Azik, I've recently learned quite a bit of ancient history. I believe you will be very interested in it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have chosen to be a history teacher after losing your memories. This history involves some concealed secrets, so it's not convenient to describe them in a letter. When you wake up, I will share it with you in person. Also, I can create a charm called Yesterday Once More. Once used, you can find your past self through the historical void and borrow power from him. This is actually not something worth paying attention to. What's most important is that you can retrieve your memories from your past self. There's no need to use decades to slowly awaken them. I believe you will like it. I attach 2 with this letter. If you wake up, you can try their effects. I'm currently in an environment filled with undercurrents. If you come over, please be careful. Please observe the situation in advance. On the matter of George III advancing to a Black Emperor, I will try to do something, but the chances of success are very slim. Finally, I wish you well. I also wish that you wake up soon. Your eternal student, Klein Moretti." After folding the letter, Klein stuffed 2 Yesterday Once More charms into the envelope. Following that, he took out Azik's copper whistle and blew it. The huge skeleton messenger immediately emerged from the floor and received the letter with his head at a height lower than Klein. Klein nodded slightly and watched as the messenger disintegrated into bones before disappearing. After doing all of this, he used 2 fingers to pull out Will Orseptin's paper crane from his wallet. He wrote on it with a pencil. "I have something to ask you." He placed the paper crane under his pillow and lay down on it. With the help of cogitation, he entered a deep sleep. In the depths of the pitch-black sharp tower, Klein once again met Will Orseptin, who was sitting in a black baby pram. Without waiting for the other party to speak, he directly asked, "Do you know who can provide the method needed to accommodate the uniqueness? What kind of price would it take? If the price is too high, then forget it." Klein added inwardly. Will Orseptin, who was sucking on his thumb, was taken aback. "You want to help me accommodate the die of probability?" Klein nodded seriously and said, "Regardless of whether it's a success or not, we should try our best." Just as he finished speaking, Will Orseptin's tears rolled down his cheeks. The chubby baby pounded his hands to the side and cried sadly. He whimpered and said, "It's useless. It's too late. I've already rebooted, and I still have to spend at least 22 years growing before I can accommodate the uniqueness. Why didn't you say that earlier? I'm really unlucky. It must have been that silly snake, Ouroboros, who took too much of my luck." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1125. As he listened to Will Orseptin's tearful complaints, Klein was at a loss as to how to react. He could only remain expressionless. After the baby wrapped in silver silk calmed down, he asked in puzzlement, "Even if I said it earlier, it's useless. When I met you, you were already rebooted." "No, I was still Will Orseptin at that time. I didn't have Series as my last name, I'd rebooted for a long time back then." The chubby baby wiped his tears and said, "Although I'm still quite some time away from becoming an adult, as long as I'm willing to take a certain risk, it's not impossible to accommodate it. With the luck I've accumulated, that risk can be resolved. But the difference now is just too great. There's no way to make up for it." With a thought, Klein said after some deliberation, "Perhaps you can find an angel from the Marauder pathway to steal time from you, allowing you to grow up faster." Will Orseptin was still choking as he shook his head and said, "It's useless. It's impossible for them to accurately steal my childhood and teenage years. If it's only a matter of time, it won't allow me to grow. It will only reduce the age I can originally live to. When the time comes, Will Orseptin's series will die prematurely, having been born June 1350 and dying October 1350, for a ripe old age of 4 months. But I've seen cases of aging rapidly due to the theft of time." Klein recalled what he had seen in Amon's mausoleum. The chubby baby still shook his head. "No, that's just a manifestation of it being symbolized. If it's used on me, it will just be a baby that starts to grow wrinkles while his hair turns white. To truly accurately steal the childhood and teenage years, it has to be Amon, and it has to be his true body in person." At this point, the baby wrapped in silver silk and Klein fell silent at the same time. No one spoke for a long time. If he were to get Amon, the years that were possibly robbed wouldn't be limited to just the childhood and teenage years. After a while, Klein took a deep breath without hiding anything. "Then there's no need to consider this for now. However, I still want to know where I can find a way to accommodate the uniqueness. If I have a chance to get it, I definitely can't miss it. Who knows when it might come in handy in the future." Will Orseptin put down his tear-stained palm and sniffed. "There's no need to ask others. I've already gotten it long ago, but I can't do it. Otherwise, do you think that me being president of the Life School of Thought was for nothing?" Klein was surprised and curious. "Why can't you do it?" Will Orseptin pulled the blanket in the baby's pram and said, "There are 3 ways to accommodate the uniqueness. One is to be born naturally with it, which is equivalent to being a uniqueness coming to life and imbuing human nature into it. The other is to make the uniqueness come to life to a certain extent before forcefully putting it into one's body. By relying on the power of the Creator to suppress it, it will slowly take quite some time to slowly wear it down before one gets used to it and achieve a balance. The third is to concoct the uniqueness into an incomplete potion and drink it with a simplified apotheosis ritual. Check for news stories on no/v/l/bin.c0m. There's no need to mention the first method. This is why those brothers are enviable. The second is impossible after the ancient sun god's death. The third is the only viable option at the moment, but for the sequence 1 of the fate pathway, it depends on the machinations of fate. The first point was mentioned in Emperor Razel's diary. It was said by Mr. Dorr. Does the second point mean that, after the ancient sun god wielded so many authorities, he was at least half a level higher than the present true deities, or even one full level? The creator's level? As if in thought, Klein asked, what do you mean by only depending on the machinations of fate? What has this got to do with me saying earlier that I can help you accommodate the uniqueness? Will Orseptin's chubby baby face revealed a look of poignancy. The apotheosis ritual for the fate pathway might be the simplest, or perhaps it's the most difficult. As long as we find the correct opportunity in the torrent of fate, we can directly consume the potion and attempt to advance. But the problem lies in the fact that the exact opportunity cannot be divined or predicted. There's no way to lock onto it. I can only eliminate certain interferences and patiently search as I experience life. I've already rebooted it countless times and I've spent ages, but I still haven't encountered it. At this point, the baby's tears flowed down again. It sounds simple, but in fact, one can only rely on fate. It really depends on how well you look. With a sigh, Klein asked in enlightenment, when I said that I would help you accommodate the uniqueness, did you vaguely grasp that opportunity? The chubby baby cried even harder. Although I didn't really find it. I did sense it to a certain extent. Is that so? Back then, when Will Orseptin came into contact with me, other than hoping to receive the help of yesterday once more, was it also pushed by luck? What a charlatan. Klein tersely acknowledged. Then there's no other way. You can only give me a few more of those charms. Will Orseptin nodded heavily. All right, replied Klein generously. He then added, you have to give me a few paper cranes. With that said, the baby wrapped in silver silk and Klein fell silent. In the rental apartment, after waking up from his dream, Klein got out of bed and walked to the room outside. He took out pen and paper and began to write to Leonard. I obtain charms that originate from high sequence beyond us of the seer pathway. It allows someone to borrow power from their former selves. Klein didn't mention that it might be something his dear poet needed, as if he was simply describing it. After folding the letter, he took out a gold coin and a rectangular diamond-like charm and blew into the adventurer's harmonica. Rionette Tinker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, walked out of the void with 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. All eyes were cast towards the yesterday once more charm. The 4 heads spoke one after another. Who to deal with this time? So direct. Klein sighed and smiled. It's unconfirmed yet. I'm going to attempt at foiling George Ill's plans. I might need your help at critical moments. The 4 heads in Rionette Tinker's hand spoke one after another. This sounds extremely dangerous. Requires higher payment. More of these charms? The comer of Klein's forehead twitched as though he had experienced the pain of tearing his soul apart. 3. Rionette Tinker's head, who had failed to join in the final sentence, shook. Klein smiled and answered, no problem, but it will take 1 to 2 weeks. Firstly, he had recently separated many wounds of spirit and made quite a number of yesterday once more charms. It made him feel like he was nearing his limit and needed some rest. Secondly, he felt that it would be another 1 to 2 weeks before he could digest the Bizarro Sorcerer Potion and attempt to advance to Scholar of Your Once Miss Magician's new book was published. When the time came, he might have a simpler method. Rionette Tinker's foreheads began to bob with the help of their hair, indicating that that wasn't a problem. Klein then pointed at the letter and gold coin. Send it to the mailbox at 7, Pinster Street. He had previously divined that Leonard wasn't at home. Apparently, he had gone south of the bridge. One of the heads of Rionette Tinker tilted up as she sucked the letter, gold coin, and yesterday once more charms into her mouth. As he watched Miss Messenger enter the void and vanish from his room, Klein pondered for nearly a minute before beginning to set up a sacrificial and bestowment ritual. Since the Bizarro Sorcerer potion was about to be completely digested, there was no doubt that he had to prepare the various ingredients for Scholar of Yore in advance. Among them, the demonic Wolf of Fog's transformed heart and white frost crystal could be obtained from the Evernight goddess. And with the demonic wolf's transformed heart, he could go to the spirit world to bait a hound of Fulgrim. After a series of tasks, he finished setting up the altar and took 2 steps back to inspect the surroundings. It's still considered clean. In addition to the Wall of Spirituality's seal, it satisfies the requirements of a ritual. I haven't made any contribution recently, so how should I ask for a bestowment? Could it be that I'm telling the goddess that I plan to take a credit loan and pay it in installments? Will this be a little sacrilegious? I'll try to sacrifice something of value. If the goddess is willing to accept it, she will do the corresponding bestowment. Something of value. As he thought, his thoughts moved to the junk pile above the grey fog. He really wanted to pack up the items he couldn't sell for the time being, such as the biological poison bottle, the interrogator beyond a characteristic, lunatic beyond a characteristic, blatherer's aura, thousand-faced hunter's blood, six-winged gargoyle's eyeball, spirit world plunderer powder, and other items to sacrifice to the goddess to exchange for the materials needed for Scholar of Yore. However, he felt that this would make the goddess seem like a rag-and-bone man, hence, he could only give up the idea. It has to be of roughly the same value. I can't use Grozelle's travels, it hides quite a bit of secrets. Perhaps it will be of great use. Yes, the next time Little Sun and the others explore the giant king's court, I can give them Grozelle's ashes. This time, I wasn't sure how far they could go in the expedition, and was worried that they were unable to return after entering the Grozelle's travels. Sea God Scepter? That's even more important. Not only is it my most powerful sealed artifact, but it also involves the believers of the Sea God. It will be my anchor for some time. When I have other things, more anchors, it can be given to Mr. Hanged Man. I've in Rambizers beyond a characteristic. This has already been promised to Miss Justice. After some thought, he realized that he didn't have many choices left. One was Life's Cane, and the other was the Flaring Sun Charm, the Fate Siphon Charm, yesterday once more charms and control spirit bullets. The latter are all disposable items. Even if they're combined, their actual value wouldn't be comparable to the main ingredient of a Sequence 3 potion. Besides, once my ability to transfer wounds improves, it can take over a portion of the Life's Cane's effects. After hesitating for a while, he finally made a decision. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1126. After bringing the wood-colored cane back to the real world, Klein immediately began the ritual. He lit the candles and burned the corresponding essential oils and herbal powder, took 2 steps back, and skillfully recited the honorific name of the goddess. Finally, he said, I sacrifice this cane filled with life to you. I'm willing to receive your blessings. He didn't directly mention the demonic Wolf of Fog's transformed heart and white frost crystal. This was equivalent to making an equivalent exchange, not offering sacrificial items and praying for a bestowment. There was no need to be too meticulous in other aspects of the ritual, but this was a case of showing his attitude at a fundamental level. He felt that he needed to be careful. When Klein finished his sentence, 2 out of the 3 candle flames swelled and intertwined, forming an illusory and dark mysterious door. The door slowly opened, creating strong invisible winds. They swept up the Life's Cane, allowing it to disappear into the seemingly endless cosmos through the gap of the illusory door. Read new chapters on no/v/e/elbin.com. Immediately following that, there was a flash as 2 items tore through the barrier and landed on the altar without making a single sound. One of them was a strange heart formed by wisps of white mist, and the other was crystalline frost that emitted cold air. Klein was delighted as he hurriedly lowered his head to thank the goddess for her bestowment. When he raised his head again, the dark and mysterious door had closed. It rapidly faded away, and the altar was completely restored to normal. Phew, it really succeeded. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and took 2 steps forward, putting away the demonic wolf of Fogg's transformed heart and white frost crystal. At this moment, the relaxed him couldn't help but have a thought that he absolutely couldn't say out loud. If I had known that it would go so smoothly, I wouldn't have had to use my life's cane. That huge junk pile might have been enough. Perhaps I didn't need to sacrifice anything, and the goddess would have bestowed them to me. The present situation indicates that she is personally supporting me becoming a scholar of yore. Of course, this way, if I receive too many bestowments, who knows what price I'll pay in the future. Using life's cane to trade for it makes me feel more at ease. Well, from the looks of it, before advancing to sequence 2 and becoming an angel, the goddess will still shower her blessings on me. In the future, it will be hard to tell what kind of developments and changes will happen. With this in mind, he reined in his thoughts, ended the ritual, and tidied up the altar. Then, he began to plan on how to deal with the Hounds of Fulgrim, the so-called Sapphira Castle keepers. A magician never performs unprepared. South of the bridge, Rose Street. Leonard changed into a black and white police uniform and wore a red glove. He led his team members and the real policeman to the only cathedral of the Church of Earth Mother in Backland. The epaulets he was wearing corresponded to a high-ranking inspector. But in fact, with his status as a captain of a Red Gloves team, he should be equivalent to a superintendent or even a chief superintendent. However, officers at that rank wouldn't involve themselves in such missions. Wearing those epaulets to the Harvest Church would easily arouse the suspicion of the public. After passing through the door, Leonard scanned the area and realized that it was empty. There were only 2 figures. One was sitting in the front pew, focused on praying. The second was the handsome man dressed in a priest's robes. He had black hair and red eyes. Emlyn White. Leonard nodded secretly as he walked down the aisle to Bishop Utravsky. He then coughed twice, making the half-giant bishop open his eyes and look over. "I'm an inspector from the Backland Police Department." Leonard showed his identification and said, "We would like to invite you back to assist in our investigations." Father Utravsky stood up slowly and asked in a calm tone despite looking down at him, "What's the matter?" "The nearby residents reported your abnormal behavior, saying that it's possible that you're a spy for Fasak or Fainapotter." Leonard explained the reason he had long come up with. At the same time, he was prepared to pull Bishop Utravsky into a dream at any moment. Once he resisted, he would try to control this blessed in the shortest time possible. With the Red Gloves team's distribution, as long as they didn't directly encounter a true demigod, even if they were to face a blessed who was in charge of a holy artifact, they would have a good chance of taking down their opponent. Furthermore, before Leonard set off, he had applied for a Grade 1 sealed artifact. This was also the reason why he had delayed taking action until today. Father Utravsky fell silent for 2 seconds before turning to look at Emlyn White, who was standing by the candle stand. Emlyn's slightly complicated expression froze. He opened his mouth but didn't know what to say. Father Utravsky retracted his gaze and nodded slightly. "Okay. So cooperative? I thought we would experience an intense battle and that we had to be very careful not to cause any casualties." Leonard was taken aback before he smiled. "Thank you for your cooperation." If there really was a battle that ended up harming a blessed of Earth Mother, Leonard suspected that the tense situation would rapidly be aggravated. Through the ancient history in Grozel's travels and the various secrets he learned from the Tarot Club and the corresponding explanations of Old Man Palace, Leonard knew that the relationship between the Church of Earth Mother and the Church of Evernight was like dried timber. It could be ignited with a tiny spark. When the time came, the history books would record today's events. The war would go from a localized problem to a fuse that ignited the globe. Leonard Mitchell had lit a religious gunpowder keg. Phew. Seeing that Father Utravsky didn't resist and accepted the protective custody, Emlyn White secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He was very satisfied with his performance at the Tarot Club. At this moment, the Red Gloves team member, Cindy, looked at Emlyn, who lacked a level of masculinity due to the gentleness of the soft moonlight. She lowered her voice and said, "Cap, sir, there's still a priest. Should we take him with us?" "Yes, we can temporarily shut down the Harvest Church for some time to prevent any accidents from happening." Emlyn. Leonard. After a few seconds and repeated deliberation, Leonard finally said if the spy case involves Faina Potter, he would also be considered a suspect. "Let's invite him back to assist in our investigations." Emlyn was stunned, unsure of what expression to show in response. East Borough, in a 2-bedroom rental apartment. Force rubbed her dark eye circles and drank the last mouthful of bitter coffee. She stood up abruptly and began changing her clothes. "Done writing?" Zio, who was enjoying her breakfast, was taken aback. It had only been a day and a half. Force shook her head and took a deep breath. "No. But I've already written the first volume. I can hand it over to the editor of the publisher. If it's serialized, there's no need to finish it all now." Zio thought and said, "This is indeed a good idea. It can effectively reduce your stress." Force's expression twisted as she closed her eyes. "I hope so." In another rental apartment a few streets away, after a series of tasks, Klein, who had come up with a plan and made his preparations, put on creeping hunger and quickly turned transparent as he entered the spirit world. Looking up, he saw the 7 pure lights that comprised of 7 different colors. He released the arms of his 2 marionettes and took out a box. He removed the wall of spirituality around it, allowing the aura of the demonic wolf of Fog's transformed heart to emanate from it. Then, he pulled Inuni while Inuni pulled Kona's. Together, the 3 of them rapidly teleported deep into the spirit world. Along the way, all kinds of strange spirit world creatures passed by them like oil paintings that depicted hell. After an unknown period of time, Klein's premonition for danger suddenly stirred as a scene quickly appeared in his mind. Red, black, white, blue, and other colors saturated and overlapped as a slender figure suddenly appeared. It looked like a hound. Its entire body was covered in black short fur, and its eye sockets were 2 balls of dark red burning flames. The ends of its mouth extended to the back of its head. It clearly existed there in its corporal form, but it gave off an illusory feeling that felt surreal. Hound of Fulgrim. Klein immediately turned around and faced it. He released his 2 marionettes at the same time, allowing them to wander in different directions. In the blink of an eye, the Hound of Fulgrim appeared. The 2 dark red flames, which weren't too deformed but were absolutely terrifying, turned and looked at Klein. Right on the heels of that, its figure became more and more illusory. It instantly disappeared, as though it was a projection from history. It ran away just like that? As Klein muttered to himself in shock, he became even more wary of the possibility of a surprise attack. More than 10 seconds later, 2 figures phased into existence. They were covered in black fur, their eyes burning, and the corners of their lips extended to the back of their heads. However, there was only 1 dark red flame left in the eye sockets of each of the 2 monsters. The remaining fireballs were in their paws. Without waiting for Klein to react, the 2 Hounds of Fulgrim lay down in the void of the spirit world and wagged their tails. They wagged their tails. Klein's mouth was agape, wondering if he was dreaming. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1127. Only after the 2 burning dark red fireballs floated over from the Hounds of Fulgrim and landed in front of him did Klein snap back to his senses. He felt puzzled and relieved. Why did they harm themselves to come up with a pair of eyes for me? There seems to be thick and sticky blood surrounding them. If this is their trap, I would have already stepped into it. To think that I fell into a daze for a few seconds. This is a fatal mistake for a bizarro sorcerer in battle. However, no matter who it is, it's inevitable that they will have similar reactions when encountering something like this the first time the terrifying enemy who they had meticulously planned to deal with had ended up kneeling down and wagging their tails the moment they see them. This is like a dream. This performance is very similar to a Rhodes's. Could the great existence above the spirit world be able to showcase special traits in the spirit world? As this thought flashed through his mind, he looked at the 2 dogs that were prostrating themselves in the void and wagging their tails. He stretched out his left hand and grabbed the two dark red flames and large amounts of thick, dark red blood. The moment he came into contact with these things, he suddenly heard familiar ravings and roars. They were sometimes shrill, sometimes dull, sometimes maniacal, sometimes seductive, sometimes crazy, and sometimes ethereal. Immediately following that, an illusory, greyish-white fog appeared in front of him. The fog spread out in all directions. Above them, there was a towering and majestic palace that looked like a god's residence. This was a very familiar scene, because every time he entered the mysterious space above the grey fog, he would pass through it. New W Novels updates on November/L/BIN.com. In the beginning, it was difficult for him to notice his surroundings after he took 4 steps counterclockwise. However, as he got used to it, and with the advancements of his sequence, he was able to easily take the opportunity to observe the phenomenon. And at that moment, Klein had enchanted the honorific name of Celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings or taken 4 steps counterclockwise. This made him extremely wary. Then, he saw a few figures appear in the endless grey fog. They overlapped with the grey fog at times while separating at other times. They were none other than hounds of Fulgrim with their eyes burning with dark red flames, and their bodies covered in short black fur. The 2 hounds of Fulgrim that had lost one eye each returned to their companion's side and blended into the dark spots in the grey fog. The entire phenomenon vanished as well. In the depths of the spirit world, Klein realized that there were no longer any hounds of Fulgrim around him. Only his 2 marionettes and strange spirit world creatures remained. Klein lowered his head and looked at the eyeballs and blood in his hand. With their presence, he confirmed that what he had just experienced was not an illusion. The hounds of Fulgrim are also known as Sapphira Castle Keepers. They live in the historical void. I saw them active within the grey fog before fusing with the dark spots. Combining what he had seen and heard, Klein gradually came to a bold conclusion. Perhaps Sapphira Castle is referring to the mysterious space above the grey fog. It's referring to that strange door of light. As for the grey fog, it's a symbolic object formed from all the history in the spirit world. There are void gaps present in it. Every time I enter the mysterious space through the grey fog, I leave certain traces there, making the hounds of Fulgrim no longer feel unfamiliar with me. They see me as the owner of Sapphira Castle, so when they saw me, they immediately offered me what I needed and shook their tails to gain my favor. After a day of planning, asking about the situation, and inviting helpers, I ended up targeting my own guards. As he thought of this, he inexplicably felt a sense of absurdity at the situation. It felt like the fool above the grey fog was reaching out his hands to fleece someone, only to end up fleecing himself. Phew. Sapphira Castle. Although this development makes me even more afraid, in any case, I still have some understanding of the owner of the grey fog and that mysterious space. The unknown is the most terrifying thing. After standing silently in the depths of the spirit world for a moment, Klein slowly exhaled and summoned his 2 marionettes back. He planned on waiting for the Bizarro Sorcerer potion to be completely digested before attempting to seek out relevant knowledge about Sapphira Castle from Rhodes and other places. When the time came, if anything were to happen, he could use his advancement to fight it. East Borough, in a 2-bedroom rental apartment. With her dark eye circles, Force returned and retrieved the day's newspaper and letters in passing. How was it? Zio, who had just returned home for lunch, asked. Force covered her mouth and yawned. Not bad. The editor I know is very satisfied with my new book's topic and writing style. He decided to arrange for its serialization as soon as possible. You might not be aware, but the horror stories of Backlund's hospitals have been very popular recently. A best-selling author had gained inspiration from it and is beginning to serialize similar stories. I'm actually not the first to do so. This is a good thing. Zio thought about it and nodded seriously. This meant that Force, who had also written the horror stories of Backlund's hospitals, wouldn't attract too much attention. Her new pen name wouldn't be tested either. I know. Force threw the newspaper aside and took out a few letters that were stuffed in it before quickly flipping through them. Soon, she found the reply letter from her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham. Force's expression immediately turned solemn as she quickly tore open the envelope. She spread open the letter and began reading. Benjamin Abraham is from Intes. He lived in Roselle's era. Apart from mysticism knowledge and a small amount of inheritance, he didn't leave anything of value behind. Later on, everything was destroyed by the Aurora Order. I'm unable to provide the corresponding information. Mr. German Sparrow is about to be disappointed. Force pursed her lips and pulled off a magic trick, burning the letter in her hand to ashes. Then, she began writing a reply, asking her teacher if she knew of the secret ruins of Blood Emperor Lister Tudor. Klein went above the grey fog and listened to Miss Magician's prayers. The trail of clues for Benjamin Abraham have come to an end. It's all the fault of those lunatics from the Aurora Order. At the same time, he learned of the serialization of the horror stories of Backlund's hospitals. After returning to the real world, and just as he was about to head out for a meal, he suddenly saw Miss Messenger walk out of the void with 4 heads in her hand. One of them had a letter in its mouth. Who sent it? Asked Klein in puzzlement. Rionette Tinker's remaining 3 heads replied, A. Seduced. Idiot. Who is that? Klein grew confused as he took the letter and opened it. The mastermind behind those matters is George III. His goal is to become the Black Emperor. Are you interested in stopping this matter? Trissy. Trissy? This demoness actually dares to write me a letter. Isn't she afraid of being caught by Miss Messenger on the spot? Oh right, Miss Messenger just said that the sender was a seduced idiot. Trissy seduced a man and got him to help her summon the messenger while she hid far away and waited for the other party to contact her through a mirror? She's pretty smart. She really is very persistent in investigating this matter. Isn't she afraid that she'll be killed by either me or George III? That man should be a beyonder. It would be quite difficult for an ordinary person to hold a summoning ritual. After all, it relies on one spirit and spirituality. Klein was first puzzled before he came to a realization. Immediately following that, he began to wonder why Trissy managed to guess that George III wanted to become the Black Emperor. Without sufficient mysticism knowledge, and without knowing the Black Emperor's apotheosis ritual or the corresponding history, even a demigod would find it difficult to guess. It definitely wasn't as easy as the Red Angel evil spirit had said. Could it be that Trissy has other helpers? Or could it be that she has obtained more power from the primordial demoness, including all sorts of knowledge and secrets? Klein frowned slightly as he felt that there was something amiss. If there was a chance, he would definitely get rid of demoness Trissy. After thinking for more than 10 seconds, he took out a piece of paper and pen from his pocket and scribbled a reply, I'm interested, but I don't know what you want to do. In the Backlund Bridge area, a man in his 30s looked in horror as the headless Womano, the 4-headed demoness, reappeared before him and dropped a letter. Are all the messengers in the mysterious world so terrifying? Only about 5 minutes after Rionette Tinker left did the man catch his breath. He picked up the letter and opened it to take a look. During this process, his gaze gradually burned because it meant that he could meet that beautiful woman again. According to her instructions, he waited until the evening before he took out the black sticky lump. He separated them and applied them evenly onto a mirror. A few seconds later, the mirror turned dark, as if it was connected to another world. In the blink of an eye, the mirror presented a room that was completely different from the present environment. There was a young girl dressed in a dark black dress. She was none other than demoness Trissy. The man who finished the ritual immediately revealed an infatuated expression as he subconsciously whispered. The reply said that he is interested. The light dimples on the sides of Trissy's cheeks slowly bloomed, making the mirror appear brighter. Her eyebrows relaxed as she said, I'll send you a letter. Forward it to German Sparrow. You absolutely cannot read its contents. After obtaining the man's unhesitant promise, Trissy stretched out her right hand and swiped it across the mirror, causing the dark aqueous light to disappear. She immediately found pen and paper and deliberated for a few seconds before quickly writing. The secret mausoleums needed for the George Il's ritual should be from Blood Emperor Lister Tudor, and there is an existence who understands it very well. It might be able to help us successfully infiltrate and cause damage during the ritual. I have a way to contact that existence, but we have to wait until the next full moon. What you need to do is provide me with some blood, hair, flesh, or bones from a descendant of the Abraham family. Trissy. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1128. East Borough, in a 2-bedroom rental apartment. After receiving the reply from Demonis Trissy from Miss Messenger Rionette Tynker, he pulled a chair to sit down and began reading. This means she knows of Mr. Dawes' existence, and she has a way to use the bloodline of the Abraham family to communicate with that entity. Trissy can already withstand Mr. Dawes' cry for help. Isn't she afraid of losing control because of this? Besides, she seems to be very sure of Mr. Dawes' identity. She really has obtained more knowledge and secrets from the primordial Demonis. But in such a situation, why would the Demonis of White Katerina be pursuing her? Questions arose in Katerina's mind as he read the short letter. As Trissy's vague mention of the matter was within his understanding, he believed that she wasn't lying in this aspect. Furthermore, she had provided a very feasible solution. Of course, the prerequisite for this method to succeed was to obtain the correct ritual and have a descendant of the Abraham family be willing to take a huge risk as they use something related to their bloodline as a medium. Of these 3 points, he was missing the first point. He still had some doubts about the third point. He attempted to find a safer and more concealed method, but Demonis Trissy seemed to only lack the second point. To me, it's easy to find the descendants of the Abraham family. I can directly contact them through Miss Magician. However, once I hand over their hair, blood, flesh, and bones to Demonis Trissy, this will put them at risk of being hexed. Klein understood the Demonis pathway rather well and knew that they were very good at hexes. As his thoughts raced, he gradually came up with a countermeasure. It was to use the hair, flesh, or bones of the deceased. He remembered that Miss Magician had mentioned to the fool that she had once buried an old man named Lawrence. He was undoubtedly a descendant of the Abraham family. I hope it wasn't a cremation. Although this is somewhat sacrilegious to a corpse, speaking to Mr. Daw is a necessary procedure to dispel the Abraham family's ancient curse. It's better to use the dead rather than implicate the living. When the time comes, I'll add this in Triss's reply. I'll claim that this is a requirement stipulated by the descendant of the Abraham family for the ritual's medium. Also, I have to first confirm that Trissy is going to speak to Mr. Daw, and not attempt to pull him back to the real world. They are either of a high level or are involved in high-level situations. It will be difficult to obtain any effective revelations using divination, but Emperor Roselle said that the ritual required to facilitate Mr. Daw's return is very complicated. It definitely can't be set up by a small number of descendants. I can get Queen Mystic and Miss Sharon to monitor Backlund's underground market and see if there are any abnormal trades of materials and personnel. Klein nodded slightly and decided to find Miss Magician in a while. He could also rush her writing. North Borough, Felt Street. On a bench, a young man in a black trench coat and silk top hat was sitting there with a thin face and a broad forehead. He looked at the withered and yellow Intis parasol trees in a daze. He wore a crystal-carved monocle on his right eye, looking rather refined. At that moment, an elder who was heading to St. Samuel Cathedral stopped in his tracks when he saw that something was amiss. He asked gently, "Young man, what are you worried about? You lost something in this war?" He suspected that the young man's relatives, lover, or friends had died in the air raid or during intense battles at the front lines. That was why he was sitting alone by the side of the street, looking lost. The young man raised his hand and pinched his monocle. He sighed and shook his head. "I'm just thinking about some rather complicated questions." "Are you a philosopher?" The old man was taken aback as he blurted out. "No, but I often bring up philosophical problems for others, just like who I am, where I am, and what's my future." The young man smiled calmly as he continued to ponder. From time to time, he would purse his lips and whisper silently. The elder couldn't understand him and could only shake his head. Under the gaze of the stray dogs, sparrows, ants, and microbes in the air, he slowly left. The young man didn't turn his head. His monocle reflected yellow leaves that were floating down as he muttered to himself, to parasite, to not parasite, to parasite, to not parasite. See the bait. Devour the bait. See the bait. Devour the bait. After getting the hair from Lawrence's remains from Force and seeing the horror stories of Backlund hospitals being serialized in the Tussock Times, Klein entered a patient state. He also promised to send Miss Magician to a new place next week to record new sights and customs. Soon, a new week had arrived. After having his lunch, he planned to take a short nap to prepare for the 3 o'clock tarot gathering. At this moment, Rionette Tinker, who was holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads, walked out from the depths of the void. One of them had a linen bag in its mouth. Who sent it? Klein suddenly had an inexplicable feeling. He had a complicated premonition as he didn't immediately reach out to receive the bag Miss Messenger was holding. Rionette Tinker's 3 free heads spoke one after another. The real, mutated king of mushrooms. This string of words. I roughly understand what's going on. Klein controlled his expression of not baring his teeth as he slowly took the bag. When he opened the bag, he wasn't surprised to see copious amounts of Demonsno mushrooms. Some of them were white and full, as though they would spurt out milk with a single poke. Some of them were black at the bottom and were embedded with thin blood-colored lines and markings. Some of them were covered in golden stars, and the mushroom cap was as large as a palm. At that moment, the mushrooms were still squirming slightly, as though they wanted to spread their hyphae and spores. After swallowing his saliva, he picked up a letter that was surrounded by mushrooms, and he started reading, read latest chapters at n/of elbin.co/m. My dear friend, German. I finally completed your request. I've invented mushrooms that can be planted in dark and harsh environments. They can grow by devouring the flesh and blood of monsters, without any other conditions. Their descendants will be divided into 2 categories. The first type will accumulate various kinds of poisons that cannot be eaten. However, they can be used as a source of poison. The other type can be used for food after being cooked at high temperatures through boiling, stewing, and frying. You must remember not to eat it raw or before it's cooked. Otherwise, they will proliferate in your body, using your flesh and blood as a hotbed. In consideration of having a variety of flavors, I've invented 11 kinds of mushrooms. Some are rich in milk. This can be directly drunk. Some are like beef. When frying them, there's no need to provide any extra oil. Some are as delicate as fish meat but without the bones. My suggestion is to roast or boil it. All of these wouldn't have been possible without your help. If I hadn't already advanced and become a druid, I might have taken a few years, or even more than a decade to resolve all the problems I encountered during the experimentation process. If you have any other ideas that are suitable for me, please share them with me. Your friend forever, Frank Lee. With the letter in hand, Klein fell silent for a long time. He looked up and realized that Miss Messenger was still waiting. He sighed silently and walked to the desk. He took out a piece of paper and a pen and slowly wrote. I'm very happy that you've succeeded. These mushrooms will help me greatly. They will effectively reduce famine in certain areas. I'm currently busy with some matters, so I don't have any new ideas for now. Your friend, German Sparrow. After folding the letter, he looked at Miss Messenger and hesitantly asked, how's Frank Lee's condition like now? The head that Rionette Tinker had previously failed to say anything spoke first. Excited. The other 3 added, animated. Happy. Satisfied. Following that, the forehead said, no longer. Afraid. Of being buried. In soil. Why? Klein subconsciously asked. The 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in Rionette Tinker's hand spat out word by word. He can extract the soil's nutrients and oxygen. Frank has really evolved quite a bit after becoming a druid. For a moment, Klein wasn't sure if he should be happy for his friend, or if he should grieve for the crew of the future. As he watched Miss Messenger leave, Klein forced himself to sleep through cogitation. Then, he woke up at 2:30 p.m. to prepare for this week's tarot gathering. At 3 o'clock, dark red beams of light rose up from the ancient palace above the grey fog and solidified into their corresponding figures. Audrey immediately stood up, curtsied, and bowed towards the end of the long bronze table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." As a senior psychiatrist, she had great control over her emotions. Furthermore, she hadn't encountered any problems this week. She was mainly seeking out donations, contacting pharmaceutical factories, and organizing medical volunteers. However, compared to the past, the cheerfulness and happiness she had when making her greeting had decreased significantly. The Fool Klein nodded slightly in response to the greetings from the members of the Tarot Club. Following that, he cast his gaze at the hermit. He still owed this lady 8 questions. Katlia bowed her head and said with an unfaultable attitude, "Honorable Mr. Fool, there are still 2 questions this time." After obtaining approval, she continued, "The first question is, what is the state of the devils in the abyss?" Queen Mystic's first suspicion is that the Emperor's mausoleum is hidden in the abyss. This is identical to the Emperor's train of thought. She is indeed his biological daughter. Unfortunately, there are no citizens that can be controlled there. The Fool Klein muttered to himself inwardly as he answered with an unchanging expression, "The current abyss is a place most devils are unable to live in." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 11:29. The current abyss is a place most devils are unable to live in? Upon hearing Mr. Fool's reply, Katlia and company inevitably felt a deep sense of shock. In mysticism, the abyss was considered by all to be the most corrupted and most disorderly place. It was where the devils lived. But now, most of the natives were unable to survive in there. Is the environment in the abyss worsening, causing the devils to be unable to adapt to it, or is it because the situation regarding the corruption, chaos, and degeneration has improved, making the abyss no longer suitable for the devils to live in? Alger quickly had 2 theories, but he didn't know which one it was. The hermit Katlia shared the same thoughts as him, but she was even more puzzled as to why the Queen would ask such a question. Regarding Mr. Fool's answer, it seemed to have a deeper meaning to it, one that could help the Queen in understanding whatever agenda she had, and its secrets. As for justice, she suddenly thought of the Church of Knowledge prophet Demigod. He had once said that the end of the world would arrive in 1368 of the 5th epoch. This was publicly acknowledged by all beyonders who were good at making prophecies. Even the deities had agreed with it. It's 1350 this year, we're only 18 years from the apocalypse. Hence, there are signs of the abyss appearing. The chaotic and degenerate environment that is originally filled with abstract meanings has broken past its limits, becoming even worse. Audrey had a rough idea of the situation, and this added to her slight anxiety and unease. As there weren't any signs of the apocalypse in the beginning, she didn't put much weight on the matter. She usually paid more attention to the current wars, casualties, and the victims of suffering. But now, the anomaly within the abyss had left her inexplicably horrified. She desperately wanted to improve herself. She wanted to finish digesting the potion and obtain the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Evin Rambis to advance to become a demigod. Only then could she have the ability to interfere and resist certain things that she didn't want to see happen. Read new chapters on no/v/e/elbinin.com. Mr. World, entrust me with more tasks. Audrey silently prayed in her heart and secretly placated her restless emotions. The members such as Leonard, Force, and Zio actually had some doubts about whether the abyss really existed. This was because, after the second epoch, the abyss had never revealed itself to the world again. The most active devils in the real world had come from the Blood Sanctify sect. Even the high-level devils and evil existences that the rituals pointed to were highly likely to be the highest echelons of the Blood Sanctify sect. Of course, the evil god, the dark side of the universe, was widely regarded as the embodiment of the abyss, but his presence was extremely low. If he hadn't occasionally responded to the ritual and showed the characteristics of the devil, he would probably be considered a pure legend, just like giant King Ormir. But even so, the secrets of the Church of Evernight that Leonard could come into contact with had also shown that it was possible that the dark side of the universe was a disguise used by other evil gods and hidden existences. This wasn't surprising to Derek. In certain places some distance away from the City of Silver, deep in the endless darkness, there were many devils that were unable to maintain their calm states. There was no lack of demigods like the demons that weren't too different from the Abyss. If not for the fact that the giant King's Court and other iconic items existed, the City of Silver citizens would definitely have suspected that the truth behind them being abandoned was that they had been thrown into the Abyss. As the thoughts flashed through the members' minds, Catelyn restrained her doubts and continued asking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, the second question is, did the things that Emperor Rozelle do in his later years have any external, unnecessary influence?" This question reminded Klein of the shocking details in Rozelle's later diary entries. Immediately, he sighed. With the posture of the fool, he slowly shook his head. No. Those things were what the Emperor wanted to do. Just as Catelyn felt an uncontrollable sense of disappointment and sadness when she heard Mr. Fool smile with a sigh. It wasn't due to an external influence or influencer, but due to corruption. It's very difficult to detect, even for him. Corruption. Emperor Rozelle was corrupted in his later years? At that time, he was already a grounded angel. How could he be corrupted? Is this from a particular true god or the underground corruption that even the ancient gods feared? Amidst the shock, Audrey came up with a guess based on the secret she knew. Alja and the other members of the Tarot Club also didn't expect such a thing to happen to Emperor Rozelle in his later years. They began to suspect his purpose behind him creating the cards of blasphemy. At the same time, they believed that Mr. Fool's search of the cards of blasphemy might contain deeper motives, much more than what they had originally deduced. In this game that involves the entire world, only important figures like Mr. Fool have the right to become a player. And we are only a card or some chips. The Kings of Angels and Sequence 1 Angels might be qualified to participate. Alja sighed as he had a desire to become a player. The story of the Emperor's later years went from being a tyrant to an evil god? A book that starts off with romance, motivation, passion, love, adventure, and even the decadent lifestyle of Inti's high society later turns into a horror story. I wouldn't even dare write something like that. If it were me writing it, I would make the Emperor's final tragic end stem from a betrayal in one's love, a marriage betrayal, or betraying an oath. Force couldn't help but let her thoughts go wild. She even had the urge to start writing a set of chronicles for Emperor Rozelle. Of course, there were quite a number of Rozelle's chronicles on the market. Some of them were even prohibited items. Corrupted. So it's because of corruption. Catelyn sighed and felt sorrowful. She sighed with emotion. In the end, the Emperor didn't end up like the story of the dragon-slaying warrior he had spoken of. From being a hero, he turned into an evil dragon. He was still a legend worthy of worship, but the sad thing was that, up to today, this misunderstanding was finally beginning to be resolved. After her emotions settled down, Catelyn recalled the matter of being corrupted. The more she thought about it, the more horrified she became. She believed that she was one of the members of the Tarot Club who knew Rozelle the best. She knew very well what height this emperor had reached in his later years. Of course, Mr. Fool was the convener, a witness, and not a member. However, a Sequence 1 angel such as him, someone who made the throne of divinity a target, had been silently corrupted. He and the people around him didn't notice it at all. This is much more terrifying than it is horrific. Catelyn secretly took a deep breath before slowly exhaling to regulate her emotions. Then, she bowed towards the end of the long, mottled table. "Thank you for your answer, Honorable Mr. Fool. I'm also thankful that you didn't ask anything beyond my means." The Fool Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he leaned back into his chair and nodded slightly. "You may begin." Just like the previous gathering, the members of the Tarot Club had either just advanced or were still digesting. They didn't have any trades to do, and they didn't need anything for the time being. After exchanging a few looks, they decided to directly enter the free exchange segment. Of course, Emlyn was a special exception. He really wanted to make a request to get someone to start a jailbreak to free him from the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral. Yes, to this day, he was still under protective custody behind Channy's Gate at the Backlund headquarters of the Church of Evernite. In his neighboring cell was Bishop Utravsky, and during this period of time, no Nighthawk had come to interrogate him. If not for the people in charge of guarding the sealed area bringing them water and food every day, Emlyn definitely would have believed that he and Father Utravsky had already been forgotten. The dark, silent environment is still all right, but it's just a little cold. But without dolls, newspapers, books, and historical documents, this life is meaningless. Besides, the Nighthawks provide me with cow blood, and it tastes nasty. The effects aren't too good either. I'm already becoming weak. Emlyn opened his mouth, but he didn't say a word because he felt that this was a very embarrassing matter. After all, he was the one who asked the Star and had pushed for protective custody. Yet, he ended up also being brought into protective custody. I hope that fellow hasn't forgotten me and is thinking of a way to get me out. Emlyn glanced at the Star Leonard and maintained his silence. Leonard maintained his posture and didn't respond to the moon's gaze. There was nothing he could do for the time being. This was because he was the one who had raised the term protective custody in front of the Archbishop. As for Emlyn White, he was a vampire viscount, equivalent to a Sequence 5 Beyonder. He was a mobile humanoid bomb that also believed in the Earth Mother. There was no reason for him to be released immediately. I can only wait for the Sanguine to protest through other channels before I have the authority to handle this matter. The Star Leonard decided to apply for a private exchange later and get Emlyn to think of a way to get the upper echelons of the Sanguine to contact the Church of Evemite. Their interaction had been noticed by Justice. She immediately thought of the question Mr. Moon had asked her last time. She suspected that something had gone wrong during the protective custody operation, but it didn't seem too serious. I heard that the priest of the Harvest Church saved quite a number of people during the Great Smog of Backlund. I hope nothing bad happens? Audrey nodded slightly and cast her gaze at Little Sun. The other members of the Tarot Club also cast their gaze towards the Sun Derek. They knew that the City of Silver had planned on exploring the Giant King's Court last week, so it was likely that the results were out. The Sun Derek sat up straight and glanced at Mr. Hangman before saying in a very natural manner, "We've completed our first exploration of the Giant King's Court. 3 dead, 1 missing, 5 survivors. We first arrived at the front door of the King's Court and saw 2 silver knights in an unknown state standing guard there. This is the name of the giant pathway Sequence 3. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1130. 2 Sequence 3 demigods were guarding the main door. As expected of the Giant King's Court. The divine kingdom of an ancient god. The members of the Tarot Club suddenly felt a similar feeling. As for the Sun Derek, he didn't pause as he continued his recount. To him, he was shocked when he first discovered the 2 silver knights guarding the main door of the Giant King's Court. However, the series of events that followed made it seem extremely ordinary, making it difficult to stir up his emotions. According to what Mr. World shared, we followed a rather hidden path to the back of the Giant King's Court. The monsters we encountered were mainly wraiths. They were restrained by the unshadowed crucifix. After we arrived at the waning forest, we tried to explore it, and we discovered that the remnants of the Giant King's will and the Divine Kingdom's powers had formed an evil spirit. It was protecting its parents' mausoleum. Derek skillfully recalled his experiences during the expedition, and the members of the Tarot Club Audrey, Alger, and the others quickly reined in their thoughts of the Silver Knight Guards and listened attentively. They were all very interested in the secret hidden in the waning forest. They wanted to know what the ancient god, the Giant King, had tried to keep from his queen and child. Thinking back to the scene he had seen, Derek paused for a moment before saying, "After purging that evil spirit, we came to the mausoleum of the Giant King's parents. There was a stone stele erected there, indicating the identity of the tomb's owner. As for the tomb and coffin, it had long been opened by someone, revealing the corpses inside. They were the corpses of 2 humans. Corpses of humans? The tomb of the Giant King's parents had corpses of humans buried in it. Godfather and Godmother? No, there wasn't any religion back then. As a demigod who knew plenty of mysteries, the hermit Catlier's first reaction was that the two corpses had another identity. Immediately following that, she recalled what the Queen had mentioned. It was a question that Emperor Razel had asked as though he had been talking to himself when he was alive. Why did the ancient documents and historical records refer to giants, elves, vampires as humanoid creatures or anthropoid creatures? Why didn't they refer humans as giant-like, elf-like, or vampire-like creatures? Could it be that all humanoid creatures had descended from humans? The giants, elves, and vampires were the mutations brought by the Beyonder characteristics that could eventually become inherited? Catlear instantly calmed her emotions as she seriously considered the possible reasons. At this moment, she felt that her potion would be digested to a certain degree once she returned to the real world. This was because the sequence of the mystery prior pathway was called Mysticologist, and the origins of the giants and humanoid creatures were without a doubt of extremely great value. They were mysticism knowledge that most ordinary demigods had no way of knowing. The Giant King's parents were humans? That must be fake. Alger immediately suspected that someone had fabricated the scene. However, on second thought, this act not only required the Rael remains to be taken away and replaced with human remains, but one had to prepare a suitable coffin to make the tomb look like it didn't belong to a giant. Furthermore, fabricating it was pointless and wouldn't affect reality too much. Alger felt that no one would be so bored as to do something like that. To be able to enter the Giant King's court and suppress a powerful evil spirit, the person that approached the two graves was at least a saint, meaning that they had long passed the age of pulling pranks. Could it be that the ancestors of all creatures were humans? This includes the elves. As he had seen too many shocking things at the Tarot Club, as well as suffer a religious breakdown from the mural on that primitive island, Alger didn't have overly intense emotions run through him. He just couldn't help but raise his hand and touch his dark blue hair. Mr. Hangman connected himself to this matter? The Giant King's parents are actually humans. From the looks of it, most of the creation myths are fake. They were all fabricated by future generations. However, there are also hidden meanings in them. Mr. Moon seems to find it unacceptable. Mr. World seems to have known about it long ago. With the help of placate and other psychological techniques, Audrey was able to compose herself the fastest, and she instinctively observed the reactions of the other members. At that moment, Emlyn was the most restless. His mind was filled with thoughts of impossible and it's impossible. If the original ancestor of giants were human, then what about the sanguine? Could it be that we were just monsters that had mutated because of Beyonder characteristics? Impossible. We were clearly created by the ancestor. She has the authority of life and creation. It's completely different from the barbaric deities like the Giant King and Elf King who only knew how to fight. As Emlyn's thoughts churned, he felt a baffling feeling that his pride was cracking apart. His intuition, his rationality, and brain told him that the son Derek didn't have any reason to lie about this matter. The possibility of other existences fabricating the scene was also very low. Hence, he subconsciously expelled the giant and elves from the ranks of humanoid creatures, and he viewed them as a branch of humanity. Leonard, Force, and Zio quickly accepted the possibility that the son revealed. To them, regardless of whether the giant ancestor was giant or human, or even a curly-haired baboon, it was no big deal. At most, it just meant that many supernatural creatures were a result of Beyonder characteristics in the bodies of ordinary creatures, but this didn't cause any meaningful changes to their concept of reality. The son Derek calmed himself down and continued in the strange silence. After leaving the waning forest, we entered the Giant King's court through the barren tunnel. On the way, there were remnant powers of corruption and concealment. We had to make the correct response in order to pass. That palace contains a mural that possesses powers related to the cycle of fate. As such, we were affected and transformed into the people who participated in a gathering. We repeated a very short process, and this process was the establishment of Rose Redemption. At this point, Derek looked around and saw that all the members had temporarily jolted out of their previous states. They were extremely interested in the organization called Rose Redemption. They all knew that this was an extremely secretive and ancient organization that followed and believed in the true creator. It was the origins of the Aurora Order, and its members were kings of angels like Ouroboros, Medici, and Sasria. Derek retracted his gaze and exhaled silently. The two people who convened the Rose Redemption are Dark Angel Sasria and Evernite Goddess Amanases. Ah? Audrey, Leonard, and Zio began to doubt their ears. They were all believers of Evernite. They never expected that the goddess would be a member of Rose Redemption, and even be one of its conveners. This was akin to saying that the Evernite goddess was a member of the Tarot Club. If not for the fact that they knew what kind of person Little Sun was, knowing that he wouldn't lie, they definitely would have suspected the truth of this matter. But now, they were left temporarily speechless. They didn't even dare to think too deeply about it. Alger subconsciously turned his body to look at the sun, listening to his slow and heavy tone. The participants included White Angel Orcuses, Wind Angel Leodero. Alger's eyelids twitched. He didn't even dare think. God of Combat Badhile, Earth Mother Omabella. For LL0W current novels on n/o/v/3l/b in.co/m. Emlyn, who was leaning against the back of the chair, unknowingly sat up straight. There was only one message echoing in his mind: the goddess of harvest, giant queen Omabella. God of the dead Salinger, god of spiritual creatures Tolsna. The son Derek's voice echoed in the ancient and magnificent palace. It made Catleya, Force, and the other members exchange looks. No one dared to say a word. It was as though they would suffer from divine punishment if they learned any deeper. After Derek finished speaking, they remained silent. The scene was strangely quiet. Finally, Catleya sighed and said, "Rose Redemption truly is powerful and terrifying. Before this, I couldn't even imagine that those existences were members." Just as she said that, the World German Sparrow said with a deep, hoarse voice, that was an organization formed to resist the ancient sun god. Later on, only a few kings of angels remained. Upon hearing their conversation, it was as if Audrey and the other members had just snapped out of their dreams. All of them subconsciously cast their gaze to the end of the long, mottled table, at the figure shrouded in grey fog. It was as though they were waiting for the ruling of the entity of authority there. The fool Klein, who had long expected such a scene, didn't respond directly. He nodded slightly and sighed. The fallen creator was born because of this. It's real. It's real. The Rose Redemption, which Mr. Fool hinted back then, actually has such a deeper meaning. What is his identity in ancient times, and what position does he take in this matter? All these thoughts instantly formed a storm that swept through the minds of the Tarot Club members. Derek looked at everyone, and seeing that no one was speaking, he could only talk about the subsequent exploration. We met the leader of the King's Court chasers outside the palace, Light Color Merskigan. He said that Dark Angel Sasria was in a state of slumber in that palace. Compared to the matter regarding Rose Redemption, news of the mysterious Dark Angel currently in slumber inside the Giant King's palace didn't stir up the emotions of Leonard, Emlyn, and the other members of the Tarot Club much. Only some of their curiosities had been satisfied. Of course, as a mysticologist, Catleya only hoped that the sun could speak a little more. After that, we returned. Mr. Fool has bestowed us with the formula for the Silver Night Potion. Towards the end of his explanation, Derek concluded honestly. Audrey and the others were still deep in thought over what had just happened. There was still a fear of being blasphemous, and no one responded. Only Alger thought for a moment and said, since the birth of the true creator originated from Rose Redemption, then he isn't unfamiliar with what happened to the Giant King's court. Why is it that Shepherd Elder Lovia was completely unprepared for this? Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1131. This is also a question I wanted to ask. The fool Klein, who was seated at the end of the long, mottled table, echoed Mr. Hanged Man in his heart. Leonard thought for a moment and tried to find a possible reason. Although the birth of the true creator originates from Rose Redemption, it doesn't mean that he knows everything about Rose Redemption. Perhaps figuring out the truth back then is one of his motives. Just as he said that, Justice Audrey objected. the angel of fate, Ouroboros, who was drawing that mural, is still in Rose's redemption and follows the true creator. If anyone had any questions, he could have just asked him directly. Perhaps the true creator's goal is to confirm Dark Angel Sasria's condition. From Shepherd Lovia's strong desire to enter the palace of the Giant King, we can preliminarily determine that. Katlia gave her own opinion. I share similar thoughts. Alger glanced at the sun and said, of course, we can't eliminate the possibility that the star suggested. Perhaps the angel of fate Ouroboros's condition isn't right, and he has lost most of his memories. One can only rely on the murals he'd left behind in the past to find his lost past. The odds are very low, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. We aren't aware of what's special or problematic with the kings of angels. As he spoke, Alger glanced at Mr. Fool as if hoping to get some hints from this existence. Unfortunately, he failed to get any feedback. It wasn't that the Fool Klein didn't have any ideas, but that he had too many ideas and was unable to list them out. Tail Devourer Ouroboros grows up by the true creator's side every time he reboots. No one knows what his current state is. After muttering in his heart and seeing that no one had any more ideas, Klein controlled the world to look at the sun. I recently obtained a batch of mushrooms that can be grown in the darkness when feeding them the flesh of monsters. I wonder if your city of silver is interested? Mushrooms that can devour the flesh and blood of monsters? Zio and company were surprised and curious. They didn't know how such a creature could exist. Indeed, there are many things in the world that we have yet to understand. This is what a scribe should record down. Four sighed and came to a realization. Katlia's eyes suddenly darkened. She sat there without saying a word or moving, like a statue. Upon hearing this, Derek was delighted. His thoughts raced as he blurted out, "Can those mushrooms automatically attack monsters?" If that was possible, then they could be used as food and also be used as the perimeter defense system for the City of Silver. I thought Little Sun would be afraid of those mushrooms. In the end, his request is even more excessive. The world's mouth twitched slightly. No, if the mushrooms can automatically attack monsters, it will be no exception for any of you. Derek immediately felt a little ashamed as he hurriedly nodded. I understand, Mr. World. Following that, he let the fake world make a further description. Some of those mushrooms can be ground into flour, others can produce milk or are rich in oil. They're equivalent to beef. Some have a flavor that's close to fish, but there are no bones. Other than milk which can be drunk directly, the rest must be cooked through steaming, boiling, frying, and roasting. Otherwise, the mushrooms will absorb your flesh and blood while inside your body, regaining their vitality, turning a person into countless mushrooms. Check for news stories on no/v/l/bin.c0m. Audrey, Alger, and the other members of the Tarot Club originally listened on with interest as though it was an exciting story, but as they listened in, they subconsciously shrank back, becoming unusually silent. Only the hermit Katlia's eyelids twitched. She decided to have a good talk with Frank when she returned to the real world. She was very worried that, one day, when the Star Pirates were to hold a vote, a large number of mushrooms would be amongst those casting that sacred vote. At this moment, after listening attentively, Derek couldn't hide his anticipation and curiosity. Mr. World, what is flour? Is it like black-faced grass powder? Also, what is milk, what is beef, what is fish? In fact, he had seen fish before, but he didn't think that they were fish. In a swamp in the southwest region of the City of Silver, there were quite a number of strange fish-shaped monsters that contain venom. They had boils all over their bodies, while others had teeth growing out of spots where their eyes were. Some of their heads had split open, revealing a white membrane layer that could be used to hunt other creatures. No matter how strange those mushrooms are, to the City of Silver, they're all good things that are worth looking forward to. The first thing they need to solve is to be in possession of something, rather than whether it's good or not. When the Fool Klein heard that, he cast the world's gaze toward Justice Audrey. Giving detailed descriptions of flour, milk, beef, and fish didn't match the world German Sparrow's persona. As a senior spectator and German Sparrow's psychiatrist, Justice instantly understood what he meant. She deliberated for a moment before saying, the milk is the liquid that cows use to rear its young. She believed that little son could understand this easily. After all, the city of Silver had pregnant women and babies. Seeing the son nod in acknowledgement, she continued, milk can provide you with a lot of nutrition and help you grow taller and stronger. Audrey didn't finish her sentence because little son, who was sitting in his seat, was very muscular. After Miss Justice finished explaining the concepts, the son Derek looked eagerly at the World German Sparrow. Thank you, Mr. World. This is exactly what our city of Silver needs. When I return, I'll immediately inform the chief. He'll definitely be very happy. What would you like in exchange? The fool Klein hesitated for a moment before controlling the World German Sparrow. The formula for classical metallurgist. No. Katlia subconsciously tried to stop him, but she ultimately held back her urge. She secretly looked at Mr. Fool, and seeing that the great existence was silent, she immediately felt a lot more at ease. All right. Derek happily agreed. After the exchange, Leonard applied to have a private conversation with Emlyn. The moment the other members of the Tarot Club were screened from them, Emlyn asked, when are you letting me out? Leonard maintained his posture and said, this isn't something I can decide on. My suggestion is to get someone to contact the upper echelons of the Sanguine as soon as possible and get them to think of a way to get you out. These two fellows created such an accident with the simple term protective custody. The fool Klein, who was listening by the side, felt the urge to laugh, but he held back. Emlyn's expression darkened. After a few seconds, he said, will it be useful finding the upper echelons of the Sanguine? The goddess is the Lady of Crimson. She still cares a lot about you guys from the moon domain. Although you do not believe in her, Leonard said perfunctorily. The real explanation in his heart was that an ancient race like the Sanguine, who had lived for several years, definitely had some connections with the various churches, especially when the Sanguine Queen was still the Night Emperor's queen. At that time, the Church of Evemite had supported the Night Emperor. Emlyn also thought of this and nodded slightly. I'll try to entrust this to Mr. World. This was the most reliable person he could think of. Just as he said that, Emlyn and Leonard suddenly spoke at the same time. That won't work. You also realized it? The moon. Emlyn immediately glanced at the star beside him. Leonard scoffed. It's such a simple problem. Emlyn returned with a scoff. But you just suggested that I contact the upper echelons of the Sanguine. I've been locked up in the Church of Evernite for days. They must have known about it long ago. They probably didn't attempt to rescue me because they're observing, wanting to know who would rescue me, thus finding my partners. Leonard looked elsewhere. That's probably the case. So, you can only continue staying behind Channy's gate. Perhaps in a few more days, they'll lose their patience and get you out. Emlyn didn't know what expression to show. After a private exchange between the human and Sanguine, the World German Sparrow looked at Force and said, give me the venue and time for the meeting. After the gathering, I'll look for you and bring you to a new place. All right. Force hurriedly applied to Mr. Fool and conjured a parchment. While handing it over, she hesitated for a moment before asking, Mr. World, what needs to be taken note of this time? Keep warm, the World German Sparrow simply replied. Keep warm. Force was momentarily stunned, unsure of what he was trying to get at. After looking at the parchment, the World German Sparrow surveyed the area and said, everyone in Backland, please pay close attention to your surroundings for anything abnormal. Firstly, it was very likely that Zaratul would fish out a Morn. Secondly, Demoness Trissy might be able to help Mr. Daw prepare a ritual. Thirdly, George III might take the final step to becoming the Black Emperor at some point in time. All right. Audrey and the other members of the Tarot Club who were in Backland nodded one after another. They recalled the recent situation and didn't find anything out of the ordinary. After another exchange, the other members requested Miss Justice to use hypnosis to help them forget a portion of their memories. After this gathering ended, one figure after another vanished above the grey fog, leaving only the fool Klein. After sitting in silence for more than 10 minutes, he thought of other questions before returning to the real world. He teleported to the agreed-upon location and waited for Miss Magician to meet him. It was almost winter, and the sky had turned darker for in the afternoon. Under the heavy black clouds, the street lamps hadn't been lit, as coal and gas resources were controlled due to the war. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1132. In the alley where few people visited, the environment grew darker as a cold wind wafted through it. Although it wasn't like a blade that could slice a person's face with its coldness, it seemed to possess magic as it slowly but firmly seeped into the clothes of people. As German Sparrow, Klein raised his hand and pressed down on his top hat. He saw Miss Magician wearing a darky-colored scarf and a thick coat. She carried a rather heavy suitcase and walked into the alley, looking extremely wary. In the Lun Kingdom, due to the Church of Evernight's influence, many of the clothes that were deemed only male also had lady versions of them. Just like in Intis, the ladies of high society often sat sideways while on horseback, thanks to a special saddle. However, Lun didn't do the same. The ladies had their own horseback attire. Klein pulled out his left hand that was wearing creeping hunger from his pocket and spread open his fingers. "Do you have a stockpile prepared?" Force suddenly felt a cold wind blow down her neck as she subconsciously shrank back. Enough for at least 2 weeks of being serialized. "I've already handed it over to the editor of the newspaper." Without waiting for German Sparrow to ask further, she hurriedly added, "I brought a fountain pen, ink, and paper." Klein nodded slightly, took 2 steps forward, and reached out to grab Miss Magician's shoulder. Force immediately focused as an illusory book appeared in her eyes as it slowly flipped through. Her surroundings immediately became dark and colorful. The reds were redder, the blacks were blacker, and the browns were browner as they overlapped each other, making her feel like she was in a trance. Force was already used to this state and had successfully recorded during this traveling process. She also carefully observed the scenery of her trip, as well as the strange and indescribable spirit world creatures that branded themselves in her mind. After a few breaths, her vision went black, and she felt a cold she had never experienced before. Her body couldn't help but tremble. Force instinctively used a magic trick to illuminate her surroundings. Looking around, she realized that she was in a wooden hut. The world German Sparrow had already vanished. "Where Amy?" Force looked at the window and saw that there was a thick layer covering it, preventing any light from shining inside. This made her even more puzzled. She came to the door, stretched out her right hand, and pulled the door behind her. With a creaking sound, she saw the snow blocking the exit. Force was stunned as German Sparrow's warning echoed in her mind. "Keep warm." In just 1 or 2 minutes, Klein had already circled the sea once. He used his prey that he had long selected to placate creeping hunger, and he returned to his rental apartment in Backland, awaiting Queen Mystic and Miss Sharon to gather information about any anomalies. In fact, with Klein's style, he would have personally taken action in this area and conducted an additional investigation at the same time. He wanted to ensure that Demoness Trissy had no plans to help Mr. Dorr escape, but considering that Zaratul was already in Backland, he decided to be cautious and give up the idea of loitering around. Under the influence of the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics, he felt that if he were to wander around Backland, it was only a matter of time before he ran into Zaratul or even Amorn. Sigh, I'd already thought of how to disguise myself. Buying a bicycle, getting a uniform, and riding it across different streets as a postman. This is the easiest way to avoid suspicion. After taking a sip of gurney sap he brought back from the sea, he leaned back into his chair and allowed his marionette, Inuni and Konas, to individually massage his shoulders and legs. The forsaken land of the gods, in the afternoon town camp. After Derek Berg opened his eyes, he immediately stood up, opened the door, and walked around the bonfire to the chief's room. Suppressing his excitement, he took a deep breath and raised his hand to lightly knock on the thick wooden door. "Please come in." Amidst the sounds of knocking, Colin Iliad's deep voice sounded. Derek turned the doorknob and pushed open the door. As he looked at Demon Hunter Colin, whose hair was white and had old scars on his face, he blurted out, "Your Excellency, I found some strange mushrooms. They can be eaten." Colin Iliad fell silent for a moment before slowly asking, "Mushrooms?" Hearing the puzzlement in the chief's words, Derek instantly recalled a mushroom he had seen before. It came from the abandoned temple of the fallen creator. It looked especially bright and appetizing, but it was essentially extremely dangerous. His mood instantly calmed down. He nodded and said, "Yes, mushrooms, different breeds of mushrooms. They can devour the flesh and blood of monsters to grow." Derek described the unique traits of the mushrooms in detail, and he explained what milk, beef, fish, and flour were. In the end, he emphasized that the mushrooms had to be fully cooked before they could be eaten. He also had to take note of the species which were rich in poison. Colin Iliad listened quietly without showing any change in emotions. After some thought, he said, "What other dangers do they have? Or should I say, points that require taking note of?" "Ah?" Derek's face suddenly flashed red. "I'll study it again." Without waiting for the chief to speak, he turned around, opened the door, and ran out. Returning to his room, he took a deep breath and sat down. He began to pray to Mr. Fool, asking him to forward the questions to Mr. World. Read new chapters on no/v/e/elbin.com. Above the grey fog, Klein sat on the high-back chair belonging to the Fool. He tapped the armrest with his index finger and silently muttered, "What other dangers are there?" Although Frank's imagination, actions, and creativity make me a little fearful, he's still a Sequence 5 druid after all. No matter how dangerous the mushrooms are, how dangerous can they be? With the years of experience the City of Silver has experienced in the dark environment, it's easy to deal with those mushrooms. In the ruins of the Battle of Gods, the futures producing of milk, the pirate's head growing a watermelon, and other shocking phenomena were due to the remnant aura and divine power of Earth Mother in that area. The real murderer was a deity rather than Frank. Man, if the formation of the forsaken land of the gods happened due to the betrayal of the ancient sun god, the things left behind in that intense battle are definitely not limited to the powers of Evernight, concealment, degeneration, and storm. Perhaps there are some areas that have the influence of the sun and the earth. After some thought, he conjured the world German sparrow and made him tell the truth. If they encounter divine powers of the earth domain, those mushrooms might experience an unknown mutation. After receiving a response, Derek rushed out of his room and ran to the chief's door. This time, the door opened without him knocking. Derek turned back to look at his teammates by the bonfire. He entered the room and casually closed the heavy wooden door. The divine power of the earth domain might cause the mushrooms to undergo an unknown mutation, he said frankly without explaining how he had figured that out. Demon Hunter Colin's expression remained unchanged as he repeated the key phrase softly, "the divine power of the earth domain." He lowered his voice and finally fell silent. 10 seconds later, he said, "After we return, we can set up a region to plant them to see the effects." "Then, what's the price?" Derek immediately replied, "The formula for classical metallurgist." Colin Iliad nodded slowly. "This has to be decided by the 6-member council. When we return to the city, I will push for this matter as soon as possible." Their expedition team would be returning to the City of Silver in the next 2 days. Firstly, after the exploration, the few who survived, as well as those who had lost their loved ones, needed time to adjust their mental states. Secondly, there was a limited amount of food left in the camp, and there was no way to plant any black-faced grass around Afternoon Town. They could only rely on hunting monsters to replenish themselves. Therefore, one of the responsibilities of the expedition team was to deliver safe food. Switching out teams would happen at fixed intervals. "Yes, Your Excellency." Derek didn't rush him. He had long gotten used to this process. After he left the room, Colin Iliad came to the window and looked at the bonfire in the middle of the camp. That flame burned quietly. In the deep darkness, the faint yellow light scattered across the entire camp. Roasting over the fire was a disgusting vampire covered in pus. A few days later, Klein separately received the corresponding feedback from Queen Mystic Bernadette, the Numinous Sect's Patrick Bryan, and Miss Sharon. He confirmed that there were no anomalies regarding material or personnel flow in Backland recently. From the looks of it, Demonis Trissy only wishes to speak to Mr. Door for the time being. Furthermore, this seems to be the first time they will establish a connection. Regardless, I still need to give a warning beforehand. This requires finesse. The more I say, the more likely a mistake will be made. Furthermore, I cannot reveal my trump card. After some thought, he found the hair of the deceased that Miss Magician had provided. He unfolded the piece of paper and wrote, "This is what you need. It's a lock of hair from a descendant of the Abraham family. The person who provided it has a request, that is to help ask the existence one question, the problem regarding how they get rid of a curse. Finally, let me remind you to be careful of Mr. Door." Klein folded the letter and tucked the lock of hair into it. He took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew on it. After a brief silence, Rionette Tinker walked out of the void with 4 beautiful heads in hand. "Give this letter to the seduced idiot," he instructed as he handed over the letter. Just as he said that, his heart skipped a beat, and he hurriedly added another question. "Can you locate him?" "Yes." One of the heads of Rionette Tinker answered the question before biting the letter. Klein narrowed his eyes. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1133. In the Backland Bridge area, according to the information provided by Miss Messenger, he found the man who had been seduced by Trissy and ended up helping her send the letter. However, Klein didn't enter the apartment, nor did he disturb his target. He stuck both hands into his black trench coat pocket and continued walking forward. Under the illumination of the street lamps, he walked all the way to the crossroads and turned into another street. During this process, a rat that was stealing food in a particular building suddenly shivered. It then gave up on the piece of cheese and followed the usual tunnel that it used to pass through, and it moved towards the target area. Then, the rat opened its mouth and let out a human's voice. "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rorsted archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua." The moment the rat finished its sentence, Klein, who had already turned into another street, vanished. There was only a spark left on the spot that quickly dissipated. He had used Flaming Jump, but he wasn't using it to travel. Instead, he had entered a hotel room that he had booked to rendezvous with one of his marionettes, so he didn't need to worry too much about being sensed by Zaratul and meet with an accident. After all, the destination was clear, the journey was short, and there was protection. In the room, with Inuna watching, he took the steps counterclockwise and arrived above the grey fog. As he sat at the end of the long bronze table, he held the sea god scepter. With the help of the prayer light, he observed the target through his true vision, the man who helped Demonis Trissy relay the news. A few minutes later, Rionette Tinker appeared in the apartment as promised. She took the gold coin and left the envelope on the table. The man trembled in fear again, but in the end, he overcame his own fear. He picked up the letter and weighed it. 15 minutes later, he carefully took out the black sticky paste, separated a small blob, and applied it on the surface of a mirror. Soon, he saw the young girl who had occupied all of his dreams in the dark mirror and hurriedly said, "That crazy adventurer just sent a letter. It seems to contain something else. I didn't open it as per your instructions." At that moment, above the grey fog, the scene Klein saw began to show a strange phenomenon. In his vision, the mirror's condition had already turned blurry. It was closer to being a dark and illusory passageway that didn't look realistic enough. It was connected to something similar in the surrounding area, forming a complicated and abstract spider web that was interwoven into a profound and strange world. Through the grey fog's true vision, he could barely make out the general situation, but he was unable to make out the details. He didn't know what strange and terrifying creatures hid within that world. In mysticism, mirrors are often given the symbolic meaning of leading to another kingdom, and are mostly related to terrifying horrors. Is this the mirror world? My Beyonder powers are completely unrelated to this domain. That's not true. If someone prays to me and attempts magic mirror divination, then there will naturally be an illusory passageway that points towards me, towards the grey fog. Strictly speaking, the mirror world isn't a real world. It's closer to the collective manifestation of doors. By connecting to different mirrors and different mysterious kingdoms, if one becomes lost in there, they might directly appear in the abyss, or even the cosmos. Of course, demigods with this ability should be able to create a reflection world and hide inside. The collective manifestation of doors. High sequence beyond us of the demoness, wraith, and apprentice pathways also have similar powers. Does the secret in Secret Sorcerer represent the mirror world to some extent? This is sufficiently mysterious and secretive. Under normal circumstances, even through true vision, there's no way to directly see the mirror world unless someone triggers it. Klein nodded in thought as he heard Demoness Triss's melodic voice reply. Throw the letter into the mirror. Can it be thrown in? As a low sequence beyonder, the man had never seen such a miraculous thing before. After some hesitation, he held the letter and pressed it against the mirror. On the surface of the mirror, the darkness suddenly spread out like ripples of aqueous light. The man felt his firm touch lighten, and he saw the letter magically pass through the glass surface and enter the illusionary, swirling interior. Right on the heels of that, the letter seemed to be attracted by a huge whirlpool as it continued to sink deeper into the room where Trissy was. Above the grey fog, Klein raised the sea god scepter high and focused on tracking the letter, attempting to lock onto the location of the demoness. At this moment, in his true vision, the dark and deep mirror world began to quake violently, turning everything into a blur. By the time the quaking calmed down, Klein had already lost traces of the letter and demoness Trissy. The aura of the primordial demon girl can even interfere with observations like this. After a moment of silence, Klein let out a sigh. It was precisely because of the various peculiarities related to Trissy that he didn't take the risk to mix his hair into the materials to locate her. It was easy for him to suffer from a terrible hex. He might even die on the spot. To Klein, death didn't really matter. After all, as long as his corpse wasn't pulverized, it was likely the case that he could be revived. But that would mean that he couldn't seize the opportunity to lock onto Trissy. She would definitely change locations quickly. Wouldn't that be equivalent to wasting a precious chance to revive? After suffering the setback, Klein quickly returned to the real world and left the Backlund Bridge area. The next morning, with an ordinary face, Klein rode a carriage to St. Samuel Cathedral. He planned on chanting the honorific name of the Evernite goddess to inform her of demoness Trissy. When the time came, if an accident were to happen on the night of the full moon, there would at least be a deity watching over Backlund, and would also be prepared ahead of time. Back then, the Evernite goddess was one of the ones who had exiled and sealed Mr. Dorr. She definitely knew the other party's tricks very well. In such aspects, Klein had never put on a strong front. He had a very clear understanding of himself. Since he couldn't solve the problem himself, he would find someone who could solve the problem to help out. As for why he wasn't doing this at home and had to go to St. Samuel Cathedral, it was because he wanted to observe the situation in the areas around Backlund Street and search for any tiny traces that spelled Amorn's arrival. Hazel and her family had once been involved with Amorn, and she herself belonged to the Marauder pathway. Be it her fate or the convergence of characteristics, she was among the high-risk group of people who could meet Amorn by chance. With regards to this, Klein didn't dare to be too careless or negligent. He reminded himself, and he made arrangements to do a self-examination every once in a while. Similarly, due to Miss Justice's follow-up treatment of Hazel's psychological trauma, anything that happened to Hazel could easily lead to her. Therefore, Klein was also very worried about the safety of this noble lady. He believed that it was necessary to check her condition through the Crimson Star from time to time. Of course, he would avoid relatively awkward periods of time. As his thoughts raced, Klein, who was already close to Felt Street, got off the carriage in advance. He allowed his marionette, Inuni, to secretly recite the honorific name of Sea God. He and his marionette, Konas, switched positions. In a sealed space that he had distorted, he took for steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog. Then, with the help of the Sea God scepter to widen his true vision, he carefully observed the situation in Backlund Street and the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation. Hazel isn't parasitized. Neither is Miss Justice. Same for their maidservants, pets, and bodyguards. The residents and staff of the Charity Bursary Foundation don't show signs either. There are no traces of any Amon-related activity in the various streets in the area. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and returned to the real world. Following that, he approached St. Samuel Cathedral and passed through the door, finding a seat in the dark and quiet prayer hall. After chanting the honorific name of the Evonite goddess in a low voice, Klein described simply, Demonis Trissy has obtained the hair of an Abraham family descendant. She plans to contact a hidden existence on the night of the full moon. I cannot be sure of her exact purpose. After sitting quietly for a while and seeing that the goddess didn't respond, nor did the archbishop appear, Klein wore his silk top hat and slowly walked out of the cathedral. At night, he switched positions and controlled a rat as a marionette as recited another honorific name. The great god of war, the symbol of iron and blood, the ruler of chaos and strife, I wish to meet you. Just like before, the rat lost its life the moment it finished praying. Following that, Klein pulled away from the area. He wanted to meet the Red Angel and talk about Mr. Door and Dark Angel Sasria. After waiting for a few minutes, with the help of another rat marionette, he saw that the other rat burst into flames, emitting a burning white flame. The flame quickly formed a short line on the ground. I don't want to see you. The muscles on Klein's face twitched indiscernibly. After some thought, he gave up and left the area. After a few seconds, the remaining burning white flames formed a new sentence. Come on, beg me. Latest novels on novel.by/n.com. By then, Klein had already left. In a house somewhere in Backland, a pale-faced Sauron Einhorn Medici stood up from the sofa in a black, red-lined robe. He frowned and muttered to himself, "Who's disturbing me?" In the blink of an eye, a full moon had dawned its light on Backland. In a room illuminated by the crimson light, Demonis Trissy stood at an altar. Around her were ritual materials: rubies, sapphires, emeralds, diamonds, pearls, and lazurite. After some complicated preparations, she lit the hair in her hand and placed it into a cauldron. When the fire was tainted with a layer of darkness, Trissy took 2 steps back and solemnly chanted in Jotun, Great Door of all doors. Guide of the endless cosmos. Key to all mysterious worlds. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1134. As Trissy recited the words, the gems around her emitted cracking sounds as they shattered into powder and floated up. They shimmered with red, blue, green, or resplendent light before rapidly gathering into a torrent that surged towards the candlelight on the altar. At the same time, strands of hair that had been burnt inside the cauldron joined the process. The fire began to expand and interweave with each other, turning increasingly dark, as if it was an illusory door that led to other worlds. Trissy immediately felt the surrounding temperature drop rapidly, as though countless dangers were seeping out of the fire. A sentence flashed across her mind. It was a reminder from German Sparrow. Be careful of Mr. Door. As expected of someone with a messenger of that level. His understanding of Mr. Door, and his confidence in knowing about my plans, might be deeper and more precise than I imagined. Trissy slowly took a deep breath and patiently waited for the subsequent changes. In just a blink of an eye, she felt that the void in the room thinned significantly. Many of the places were covered with shadows, as though there were large amounts of indescribable creatures hiding behind them. The dim, expanding flame slowly turned into a gigantic, deep crimson vortex. As the vortex spun, an ethereal voice that could pierce through one's spirit body finally sounded from the bottom, cheek. Upon hearing this voice, the blood vessels in Trissy's forehead throbbed. It was as if her head had been pierced by countless steel needles as they crazily stabbed and twisted. Her black hair flared up despite the lack of wind. Every strand grew slightly thicker, and the skin on her face became transparent. Her blood vessels protruded out one after another, densely packed like a spider's web. After spending a great deal of effort, Trissy finally managed to control herself. She then heard the voice that could make most beyond us lose control, chuckling and saying, "It looks like its cheeks blessed." Back then, we had seen the second blasphemy slate together, and we were able to surpass sequence 1. And live to this day. Now, the only ones left are likely the artisan, Cheek, and me. Trissy ignored Mr. Door's poignant sigh and said with a twisted expression, Honorable Mr. Dorr, I have something to ask you. Find the newest novels on n/o/velbin.com. Speak. The time spent being lost and trapped in the darkness and the storm is just too boring. It's rare for someone to have a chat with me. The terrifying voice replied without much change from the slowly rotating dark vortex. Triss's facial muscles twitched involuntarily, still unable to get used to the ravings of this evil god's equal. She paused for a few seconds before saying, I want to know if there are any unorthodox ways to enter the 9 secret mausoleums built by Blood Emperor Tudor for becoming the Black Emperor. It was unknown where he was, but Mr. Dorr's ethereal laughter sounded through the endless void. So it's because of this? This isn't difficult. I'll give you a symbol. You can gather the blood of Beyonders from different pathways and mix them together. Mixing it with your spirituality, draw the symbol in front of the mausoleum. Then, you can open the secret passage that leads into it. As the existence spoke, sparks separated from the dark vortex, forming a rather complicated symbol in midair. It was like doors that were stacked in decreasing sizes as they randomly extended without end. Trissy held back the excruciating pain of her spirit body tearing apart. She memorized the symbol and sought confirmation. There must be blood from all 22 Beyonder pathways? Each pathway only requires the blood of a Beyonder, regardless of his sequence. How much blood of each pathway is required? Mr. Dorr replied in the same way that he had been raving in earlier, right, there's no need for too much. Just a small tube will do. Just guarantee that the symbol drawing can be finished. Although Trissy wore a painful grimace, she couldn't help but smile when she received the critical information. This, combined with her overall expression, made her appear odd, as though she was a lunatic. After completing her main goal, Trissy asked again to ensure smooth cooperation with German Sparrow in the future. The Abraham family wants to know how to get rid of the ancient curse. The dark vortex was silent for a few seconds before sighing. Set up such a ritual. Sacrifice one of the demigods of the seer, apprentice, and marauder pathway. Once I leave the storm and penetrate the darkness, the curse will no longer exist. Trissy wasn't interested in how the Abraham family could escape the ancient curse. After receiving the answer, she couldn't take it any longer. As she thanked Mr. Dorr, she began to stop the ritual. As for Mr. Dorr, he didn't attempt to bewitch, threaten, or corrupt her. After the dark fire vortex disintegrated and the ritual ended, Trissy began to cogitate, spending nearly an hour to calm the effects of Mr. Dorr's ravings. After doing all of this, Trissy took out a pen and paper and copied the symbol provided by Mr. Dorr. She described the 2 answers in detail. She knew that she was being pursued by Saintess of White Katarina, and there seemed to be even more terrifying hunters that would follow her wake. It was very difficult for her to find the blood of Beyonders of different pathways that quickly, so she planned on leaving this matter to German Sparrow. In addition, she believed that even if George III and the others believed that there was no problem with the secret mausoleum and that it was safe enough, thus not leaving too many guards, there were still precautions inside. It wasn't something that a sequence for could quickly force their way through and cause damage. That way, they would be stopped by the reinforcements and lose their best chance. As for German Sparrow, even his messenger was at the level of an angel. The strength of the organization behind him was obvious, so they had the ability to destroy the mausoleum at the critical moment, causing the Black Emperor ritual to fail. She couldn't complete it herself, so of course she had to find assistance from someone with the ability to accomplish it. After throwing the letter into a mailbox on a nearby street, the black-haired, black-coated Trissy slowly walked down in the cold and lonely road. On the dim road, she looked at the light from the gas lamps and laughed self-deprecatingly. For the sake of a little indignation, I've actually gone this far. You're lucky. At least I'll avenge you. And if I die, apart from those who hate me, no one will remember me. After receiving the letter from Miss Messenger, Klein sat on the chair and read it several times. Before he went above the grey fog to divine the authenticity of Mr. Dorr's method, he subconsciously thought about how quickly he could gather the blood from the 22 Beyonder pathways. This symbol is very similar to the symbol behind Miss Magician's chair. I can use my own for seer. For apprentice, I can find Miss Magician and also give her some pressure to write. There are 3 choices for the Marauder pathway. Transform a marionette into a mosquito and send a mosquito to bite Hazel, obtain it from Vice Admiral Iceberg's 3rd mate named Flowery Bow Tie, and lastly, get it from Leonard's grandpa. The Spectator pathway, Miss Justice. The Bard pathway, Little Sun. The Storm pathway, Mr. Hanged Man. The Reader pathway, Vice Admiral Iceberg, or that demigod named Luca. Secret suppliant, get the 2nd mate of Hermit, Bloodless Heath Doyle. The Corpse Collector pathway, Numinous Episcopates Patrick Bryan. The Sleepless pathway, My Dear Poet. The Warrior pathway, most of the citizens of the City of Silver, or Father Utravsky. Planter, Frank. Apothecary, Emlyn. Arbiter, Miss Zio. Lawyer, Marionette Coners. Hunter, Danitz or Anderson. Demoness, get Trissy to provide it herself. Prisoner, Miss Sharon or Marie. Criminal, I temporarily have no targets. Mystery Prior, Hermit. Savant, Frank's experiment assistant. Monster, Marionette Enan L. From the looks of it, most of them can be obtained in a very short period of time. The corresponding channels have sufficient trust in me and believe that I wouldn't curse them with their blood. This Demoness Trissy definitely has a way to eliminate the connection between the blood and the actual body. She won't object. Only Devil. Although I've encountered a few, they have either died or fled. Currently, I have no target in mind. Yes, I can ask Little Sun if the City of Silver has any devil flesh and blood left in its inventory. They will encounter some from time to time. If he hadn't thought about it, Klein wouldn't have realized that, in less than 2 years of his transmigration, he had actually established a deeper connection with most of the Beyonder pathways. He immediately retracted his thoughts and seriously considered Mr. Dawes' escape ritual. Sacrifice one of each, Marauder, Apprentice, and Seer Demigods. These are the 3 pathways that can be interchanged. Mr. Daw wants to temporarily reconcile the 3 pathways and use an ingenious method to open the passage to return. The demigods of these 3 pathways aren't that easy to capture. It's possible for the Abraham family to do so at its peak. After the death of the High Sequence beyond us in the War of the 4 Emperors and the corresponding setbacks, it's pretty much hopeless. If Mr. Daw could be more patient and give the descendants more time to grow, it wouldn't be impossible. However, he still constantly cries for help, causing the deaths of promising descendants. Is he crazy? A lunatic who looks like a normal person? After some thought, he burned the letter and went above the grey fog to do 2 divinations. The revelations he received was that the method to enter the secret mausoleum was real. Mr. Dawes' return ritual was also true. Looking at the spirit pendulum in his hand, he sat silently in the high-back chair for a long time. After a few minutes, he clenched his left hand and gripped the topaz pendant tightly. He muttered to himself, all there is left is to wait for the Bizarro Sorcerer potion to be completely digested, and for George III to hold the ritual. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1135. On the Sonia Sea, Pazu Island. The Blue Avenger, which had been summoned, finally arrived at the headquarters of the Church of the Lord of Storms. It was Doctor to port. Alger removed the cloth wrapped around his head and jumped off the shipboard, landing firmly on the dock thanks to the wind. The wind-blessed potion he had consumed had long been digested. The reason why he had done so was to make himself appear more like the other members of the church, making them feel a sense of kinship. Years of experience told Alger that it was best to maintain uniformity with the people around him most of the time. He didn't want to appear out of the ordinary. Under the circumstances where he had plenty of secrets, it was even more imperative to do so. Ha ha, Alger, control your impatience. A man who had been waiting at the dock came forward with a smile. He had a head of soft yellow hair and a long robe embroidered with lightning patterns. He was Alger's former partner, but later on, one chose to be the captain of a ghost ship and continue floating out at sea, while the other returned to be a clergyman. Alger smiled as he raised his right hand and struck his left breast. "May the storm be with you. May the storm be with you." The yellow-haired man, who was in his prime, replied with a smile. He immediately lowered his voice and said, "I heard that you've already adapted to the wind-blessed potion? Read latest chapters at n/elbin.co/m. Yes, it's very simple. I fly every day and maintain the state of floating. I often use the wind to travel back and forth in different places to quickly adapt. I've already sent a telegram to report this matter." Alger arched his brows to look proud. The yellow-haired man looked around and maintained his volume from before. "It's no wonder you were summoned back. I heard that, because of the ongoing war, there's a lack of manpower on all sides. The Council of Cardinals has decided to organize a group of wind-blesseds to advance to Sequence 5 as soon as possible. You should be within those ranks. How enviable. I just became a wind-blessed, so I don't have the chance. Organize a group of wind-blesseds to advance as soon as possible." After knowing that there might be a world war ahead of time, Alger Wilson wasn't surprised. A word suddenly appeared in his mind: cannon fodder. In fact, just from his contributions for the Banzi Harbor incident, Alger, who was only a seafarer back then, could have advanced to Ocean Songster without any obstacles. Furthermore, he was usually hard at work, having completed countless missions. In the end, he had only become a wind-blessed. He had to join the queue for an opportunity to advance to Sequence 5. And now, there was no need for him to do anything. He was suddenly placed on the list of candidates, and he would soon enter the ranks of the quasi-upper echelons of the church. He couldn't help but feel suspicious. Indeed, once a full-scale war begins, the order that prevents people like us from rising will split apart. However, the most important thing is to survive the war. Only by surviving will everything be meaningful. As Alger's thoughts raced, he asked in surprise, "Signs, is that true?" "I can't be sure. In short, that's what I heard. Let's go and catch up. If you have the chance to become a high-ranking deacon or a cardinal, don't you forget us." The yellow-haired man named Signs reached out his hand and patted Alger on the shoulder. Alger dodged without a trace and replied with a smile, "Definitely point one." In the city of Silver, the expedition team brought back news that there was a sea on the other side of the giant King's Court. All the citizens temporarily entered a state of excitement. After 2 days of waiting, Derek Berg finally received a notice from the 6-member council, permitting him to receive the classical metallurgist's potion formula. This meant that the upper echelons of the city of Silver had agreed to exchange for the special mushrooms. The advancement ritual is to personally refine a stone of life. What's a stone of life? There's no explanation here. Derek glanced at the parchment in his hand and began preparing a ritual without much thought. In his opinion, Mr. Fool definitely knew what the stone of life was. He didn't need to worry about Mr. World. After setting up the altar, he took out 2 metal tubes, each containing the blood of him and a Dawn Paladin from the city of Silver. The Dawn Paladin had reached a certain age, and his body could no longer withstand the corrosive effects of the poison in most foods. In the foreseeable future, he would gradually reach the end of his life. 2 days ago, his granddaughter had personally delivered the final stab with a sword. As for Derek, he had previously obtained the chief's approval and found an opportunity to extract some of the deceased's blood. As for the devil's blood that Mr. World needed, the City of Silver's inventory temporarily didn't have one. However, Chief Colin Iliad said that, as long as the mushrooms could satisfy the needs of the City of Silver's food requirements, he would organize a small hunting team and go to a region where devils appeared. After placing the 2 metal tubes and goatskin parchment onto the altar, Derek took 2 steps back and faced the lit candles as he began the sacrificial ritual. After a series of tasks, the illusory door that was formed from flames and spiritual materials opened heavily. After the sacrificial items were taken away, a dark glow was left behind. The brilliance slowly faded as large numbers of mushrooms of different shapes appeared before Derek's eyes. As for whether they looked strange, Derek didn't even think about it. This was because he had seen mushrooms once abnormal ones. Therefore, he lacked a point of reference for comparison. After recalling Mr. World's description of different breeds of mushrooms and effects, Derek quickly categorized them and placed them into different leather handbags. Immediately after, he picked up the unshadowed crucifix excitedly and prepared to head for the spire. However, just as his hand touched the bronze cross, he felt it burn and feel prickly. It was as if a light was seeping out of the rust and shining at the mushrooms. They're evil and need to be purified. Derek was confused, but he eventually decided to believe in Mr. World. He hid the unshadowed crucifix and carried Thunder God's roar. He walked all the way to the spire and met Chief Colin Iliad. "Are these the mushrooms?" As he spoke, Demon Hunter Colin's eyes reflected two complex dark green symbols. His gaze swept across the different mushrooms that were either pure white and full, or filled with flesh. "Yes." Derek began introducing them, one by one. Colin returned to normal and remained silent for a few seconds. "There's an evil and tainted aura emitted from them, but they're in minute amounts and can be tolerated. This must have settled down after they devoured the flesh and blood of monsters." He paused for a moment before saying, "Let's first test their proliferation ability." Following this sentence, a number of City of Silver personnel, who were prepared to usher in the mushrooms, carried a few monster corpses into the chief's room and scattered them over the different kinds of mushrooms. The moment those mushrooms came into contact with the flesh, they immediately grew hyphae and burrowed into them. About 20 to 30 seconds later, they began to rapidly expand and spit out spores. After a while, the corpses of those monsters were densely covered with mushrooms. However, the mushrooms didn't stop growing. They kept growing upwards, and in the end, some of them were even taller than Derek Berg, facing him as if they were looking down at him. Mr. World didn't say that they would grow this large. Besides, the speed at which it grows is way too fast. Derek looked at it in a daze, but he didn't think it was a problem. There wasn't much of a change in Colin Iliad's expression. Only after the monsters were left with skeleton and dregs did he look around. "It's better than I expected. Next, who wants to try the effects of eating it?" Without hesitation, Derek took a step forward and said, "Your Excellency, I'll do it." He was in charge of importing the mushrooms, so he definitely had to personally confirm its safety. Colin Iliad nodded slightly and said, "Okay." He then turned his head and said to another City of Silver resident, "Invite Elder Lovia over to prevent any accidents." As a Beyonder who controlled flesh and blood, Lovia could resolve most of the changes in the human body. Of course, whether the mutated individual could survive was another matter. Everyone waited for a few minutes before Shepherd Lovia, who was wearing a deep purple robe, arrived in the chief's room. She had just passed through the door when her light grey eyes suddenly narrowed. She instinctively looked at the mushrooms that occupied most of the space. After staring at it for a while, Lovia looked at Colin Iliad and nodded slightly, indicating that she was ready to provide any help. Without any hesitation, Derek Berg chose a black mushroom that was embedded with blood-red threads and marbling, standing at half his height. He tore off the mushroom that had wrapped around the skeleton, and he produced a bonfire and began roasting it. Gradually, a fragrance that seemed to be able to drill into one's stomach emanated out. This was a smell that the residents of the City of Silver had never smelled before. Their throats bobbed as they instinctively swallowed a mouthful of saliva. The bonfire emitted a sizzling sound before the fragrance grew stronger. This wasn't the usual sound. It was as if it could make one's soul yearn for this strange smell. It was the type that everyone was rather familiar with. It was the natural desire for black-faced grass food after returning to the City of Silver, having not eaten them for a long time. As the sizzling sounds grew louder and frequent, they felt as though a hand had reached out from their stomachs, eager to grab the food back. Unknowingly, the other City of Silver residents who had been doing something else in the spire had followed the fragrance and gathered at the door. It took Derek a great deal of effort to control himself from tasting the mushroom midway. He waited until it was completely charred yellow on the outside before he took it back and blew at it. At that moment, everyone's eyes were on him, including Colin Iliad and Shepherd Lovia. With his faith in Mr. World and Mr. Fool, Derek didn't speak. He lowered his head and bit the mushroom. SSSS. He let out a sound of being scalded before chewing and gulping it down. After nearly half of the mushrooms were gone, Derek raised his head, his face slightly red. His mouth was glistening with oil as he mumbled, "It's such a weird taste. I can't help it. I can't stop." Colin Iliad sized up Derek for a few seconds before turning his head to look at shepherd Lovia. Lovia slowly shook her head and said, "No problem." The surrounding people of the City of Silver immediately let out cheers as they rushed forward and surrounded Derek. They either wanted to share a piece or ask him what to do with the other mushrooms. When Colin saw this, his expression gradually relaxed. He slowly closed his eyes and lifted his chin. He took a deep breath of the fragrance that had filled the room. The City of Silver held a mushroom ritual? Isn't this a little strange? Also, what's a stone of life? Yes, the people from the Church of Earth Mother definitely know, and Frank is no exception. Above the grey fog, as Klein listened to Little Son's latest report, he opened the parchment that he had received but hadn't had the chance to read in detail. The reason why he had rushed back to the real world after the sacrificial and bestowment ceremony was because the serialized horror stories of Backlund's hospitals in several newspapers had reached its climax. Hence, he received a lot of feedback over the past few days. He was at the critical moment of having his Bizarro Sorcerer potion digested. And now, he had already completed this step. He was already prepared to advance to Scholar of Yore. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1136. Putting down the classical metallurgist potion formula, Klein cast his gaze towards the 2 tubes of blood Little Son had sacrificed. Then, he beckoned for a ceramic jar wrapped in layers of paper figurines. This was the Beyonder blood from different pathways that he had previously gathered. It had been placed above the grey fog and sealed with the paper angel in order to slowly integrate it into this mysterious space's aura, removing the connection between the blood and the individual. This was to prevent any accidents from happening to the provider when the door of the symbols was opened. To him, it was fine if he suffered backlash. After all, there was at least one more chance of him reviving. If it would affect those who trusted him and gave their blood, he would rather not do it. After peeling off the paper figurines at the mouth of the jar and pouring the 2 tubes of blood into it, he conjured a glass stick and reached in to stir it. Right on the heels of that, he used Paper Angel and sealed it again. "I'm just short of prisoner, devil, and demoness. After I complete the ritual, I'll personally pay Miss Sharon a visit. It's better to make a request in person regarding such matters. It's too rude to do it by writing letters. Only Miss Magician is a little special. Clearly, she would prefer it if I wrote a letter rather than meet German Sparrow in person. She actually used the excuse that the ink had frozen due to the low temperatures to delay her writing. Are her magic tricks just for show? Thankfully, my potion has already digested, so there's no need for me to push her anymore." Klein mumbled inwardly as he threw the ceramic jar covered in paper figurine back into the junk pile. After leaving the world above the grey fog, he didn't immediately prepare to advance to Scholar of Yore. Instead, he took out a pen and paper and drew the symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. This was something he had planned to do before he consumed the potion to ask Rhodes about Sapphira Castle. As the symbol took form, the light in the originally badly lit room became darker, as if clouds were drifting past, blocking out the sun. After more than 10 seconds, the full-body mirror with cracks suddenly rippled with aqueous light and silver words quickly appeared. "Exalted Great Master, your devoted, loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, is here to answer your summoning. I am still the servant that you trust the most, the closest and most favorite, right?" This question. I seem to be able to read the panic and anxiety of this magic mirror. Does it feel a sense of danger? After some thought, he nodded in amusement. Yes. Actually, that has never been the case. I'm just comforting you. After answering, he silently added in his heart. The surface of the mirror lit up and the silver words were dyed golden. They squirmed and formed a new sentence. "Great Master, do you have any questions for me?" "Yes." Klein secretly tensed up. "What do you know about Sapphira Castle?" Rhodes fell silent for a few seconds before the pale golden words changed. I don't know much about this. I've only heard some rumors. In the early days of the Second Epoch, the ancient gods believed that the original creator left some things behind. That might be a kingdom formed from a certain part of his body or something created by him. And Sapphira Castle is one of them. This was the name that the king of demonic wolves, Phlegria, gave. He calls the hounds of Fulgrim as Sapphira Castle keepers. However, he failed to enter Sapphira Castle even to his death. Therefore, many powerful creatures suspect that Sapphira Castle doesn't actually exist, but is just an abstract concept. It had something to do with the original creator? After pondering for a while, he said, one of them. How many other entities like Sapphira Castle are there? 8. There are detailed records on the second blasphemy slate. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it. On the surface of the mirror, lines of words appeared one after another. However, the pale gold color faded away, becoming silver once again. The ancient gods suspect that the source of the underground corruption comes from a place similar to Sapphira Castle. They call it the Chaos Sea. Also, there are rumors that deep in the spirit world city, Calderon City, there are clues to the river of eternal darkness. This comes from the ancient god, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace. As for the others, I've heard of some names, but it's not a complete list. There's Tenebrous World, Knowledge More, as well as the Brood Hive that's related to the moon. There are a total of 8. Chaos Sea, River of Eternal Darkness, Knowledge More, Tenebrous World, and Brood Hive. Brood Hive is related to the moon. It sounds very dangerous. I wonder if it has anything to do with the Mother Tree of Desire. Klein silently repeated the key information in Rhodes's response. He had a nagging feeling that he should be able to grasp something, but he didn't gain much from it. He even lacked the ability to piece together the clues. When he saw that Rhodes had only heard rumors and didn't have any actual understanding of them, he organized his thoughts and said with a smile, from the looks of it, you might come from the Chaos Sea. That's not important. What's important is that I'm your loyal, lowly, and obedient servant. Rhodes said the entire sentence at once. Obedient, this use of words. Klein silently lampooned before asking, what are the origins of Dark Angel Sasria? On the surface of the mirror, silver words formed one after another. I similarly can't see it, but at that time, there was a myth that said that, when the ancient sun god was born, here was light and darkness combined. After all, he calls himself the creator, so he must be well-rounded and not lacking anything. Later, he separated the darkness in his body and used it to create the first angel with one of his ribs, Dark Angel Sasria. This rib. I can totally imagine it. Back then, it was the ancient sun god who personally fabricated and spread this myth. Amorn's brother, your wife has become the Dark Angel. Klein was first alarmed before many strange ideas arose in his mind. As his thoughts settled, he began to analyze the truth behind this myth. With such a myth spreading, it will cause the believers to believe that Dark Angel Sasria is the dark side of the ancient sun god. They would worship him in the same way as the Lord. No one objected or forbade this myth. As for Dark Angel, he was ultimately the deputy of the divine kingdom, God's left hand. So this implies that this was very likely true. What happened afterward can be summarized as the dark side of the ancient sun god colluding with foreign enemies, bewitching the kings of angels and assassinating the main body. This can explain why Ouroboros and Medici joined Rose Redemption. They were only following the orders of the Lord. From this angle, isn't the position of Dark Angel Sasria, in the ancient sun god's divine kingdom, equivalent to the world of the Tarot Club? Thankfully, the world is a fake person. He doesn't have his own spirituality and thoughts. As he thought about it, he suddenly felt drenched with sweat. He was glad that he was a seer and not some other pathway. Based on his previous reasoning, he quickly guessed the reason why Dark Angel was sleeping in the giant king's court. Perhaps it has something to do with the fall of the ancient sun god. Therefore, the brother of Amorn, the dragon of wisdom, and the true creator wished to confirm the state of Dark Angel Sasria. However, there are many other problems. In the 22 Beyonder pathways, which pathway is this king of angels, the left hand of God? The marauder has Ammon, apprentice has Mr. Door, spectator, reader, bard, sailor, secret suppliant, warrior, sleepless, planter, savant, monster, hunter, and arbiter are obviously impossible. Corpse collector is also impossible due to the existence of death in the fourth epoch. It's impossible for there to be a king of angels to exist at the same time unless the dark angel had already fallen to sequence 2. By the same logic, the seer and lawyer pathways can be eliminated for now. It can then be confirmed that the dark angel is no longer a king of angels. Mystery prior, moon, and devil are all certain possibilities. I cannot eliminate the possibility that the hidden sage, primordial noon, and the dark side of the universe are the dark angel's alt. Yes, there might still be the mother tree of desire hidden within. It's also possible with prisoner. There's no clear evidence that this pathway has produced a true deity. Back then, the chained god might not even be a king of angels. After some thought, he said to Rhodes, "It's your turn to ask." On the cracked full-body mirror's surface, silver words twisted together and formed a new sentence. "Great Master, may I guess what you want to ask next?" Klein nodded slightly and answered, "Sure. You wish to ask about Sasria's current state." My answer is, I don't know, as I can't see. Behind the silver words was a smiley face with a simple drawing. "Not bad," Klein praised. "That's all for today. I will summon you again in the near future at any time." "Yes, Great Master. Your loyal servant, Rhodes, is constantly preparing to serve you." On the surface of the mirror, the simple smile on his face turned into a waving cat's paw. When the mirror returned to normal, Klein took out a pen and paper and wrote down what he had just learned. This was one of the documents he had prepared for the scholar of your ritual. In the past few days, he had written a lot of documents on ancient history. Following that, with the information and 2 marionettes, he teleported to the southern continent. He didn't dare to advance in Backland. If anything were to happen to him, Ammon and Zaratul would definitely be able to detect it and come straight for him. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1137. On a barren island in the Berserk Sea. This place wasn't far from the southern continent, but it didn't belong there geographically. The reason why Klein had chosen this island as a place for himself to advance to Scholar of Yore was, firstly, because he wanted to avoid Ammon and Zaratul to the best of his ability. He also didn't want to enter the region where the Mother Tree of Desire had a wide range of influence. Secondly, because the Berserk Sea was enveloped by the power left behind by death, this was, in a way, a part of the Evernight goddess's kingdom. If the ritual were to create a huge commotion, it was possible for some effective screening. Furthermore, this place is very desolate. There aren't many creatures here, so there's no need to worry about any accident affecting the innocent. Klein surveyed the area and began to set up a ritual. He brought the corresponding materials back from above the grey fog to the real world. Following that, he flipped through the thick ancient history documents and pulled out some records that he couldn't be certain of. Those that couldn't be confirmed with divination were also removed. Pa! With a shake of his hand, the scarlet flames rose and devoured the stack of paper. The supplementary ingredients needed for the Scholar of Yore potion were a large amount of real ancient historical records. Therefore, he didn't want to take the risk of using things he couldn't be sure of. He would rather have fewer of them. After making his selection, he poured the Hound of Fulgrim's blood into a huge cauldron and placed the few white frost crystals that he had weighed beforehand into it. The moment the 2 supplementary ingredients came into contact with each other, a thin mist immediately rose up. It enveloped the container and was about half the height of a person and an arm wide. With a glance, Klein followed his spiritual intuition and temporarily gave up on adding the last supplementary material. He first got his marionette, Inunai, to grab the demonic wolf of fog's transformed heart and threw the item that seemed condensed from white mist into the cauldron. As white frost condensed across Inunai's arm, the mist that emanated from the vessel became extremely dense. It began to contract and expand, as though it was alive, like a slowly beating heart. Without any hesitation, Klein controlled his marionette, Inunai, to pick up the pair of eyes from the Hounds of Fulgrim. he stuffed the two dark red flame-like objects into the seemingly corporeal mist. The mist's color quickly darkened, making it impossible for him to see the huge cauldron at its core. He didn't panic. Instead, he calmly got his other marionette to throw page after page of the ancient historical records into the blob of thick, dark mist. The thick mist slowly collapsed. After digesting the historical records, it finally fell back into the cauldron, like water vapor, turning into something that coexisted as both a liquid and a gas. Its color was dark red, almost the size of a baby's head. Upon seeing this scene, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist and used divination to determine if the potion was successfully concocted. He received a revelation that it was rather dangerous, but one that he could barely withstand. And this meant that the potion was successfully concocted. Even if it was strictly concocted according to the formula, a sequence 3 potion is equivalent to poison. If I can withstand it, I'll advance. Otherwise, I'll go crazy, lose control, or even die. After staring at the topaz pendant spinning rapidly in a counterclockwise direction for a few seconds, he pulled up the silver chain and wrapped it around his left wrist. He cast his gaze at the potion floating in the cauldron as thoughts flashed across his mind. A bizarro sorcerer's acting not only has the key turns of fear, horror, directing, and inexplicable, there's also some level of mystery, unknown, complicated, and unpredictable aspects of fate. The two aspects combine to form a complete bizarro sorcerer. This is a behavioral style, while the other is the attributes. And to me, my origins are such a mystery that I haven't even figured out the truth. I've experienced so many complicated matters that I've already stopped a true god from descending, scared a king of angels. Even my fate is so unpredictable that a snake of Mercury is unable to discern. Therefore, I've already acted in advance and naturally digested that portion of the potion. There's no need to summarize the principles. This truly reflects the single word bizarro. Yes, the ritual requirements for Scholar of Yore requires me to be completely separated from reality for at least 300 years. Only after I become history and no longer belong to the present era do I consume the potion. My life while I was sealed within a cocoon and hung above the grey fog is more than enough. But after becoming Klein, I've experienced too many things in the past year. I've already left a mark in the present era. Would it affect the effects of the ritual? It should be. Fortunately, it hasn't even been 2 years. The mark won't be too deep and can barely be accepted. After all, it's impossible for me to hang myself up for 300 years again before I consume the potion. There's another decade or so until the apocalypse. Furthermore, the ancient history I grasp is definitely far superior to any bizarro sorcerer. It can be considered as me effectively acting ahead of time. I can definitely avoid many dangers. As his thoughts raced, Klein took a deep breath and stopped thinking about it. Wearing a silk top hat and a double-breasted coat, his skin suddenly turned transparent as maggots that contained 3-dimensional symbols crawled out. The transparent maggots were itching to move, as if they were going to crawl into the dense mist in the cauldron, leaving behind only empty clothes and hats. Klein managed to barely control his state as he calmly extended his right hand and picked up the potion that was wrapped in mist. The potion didn't seem to have any weight as it floated in front of his face. Klein opened his mouth and took a deep breath. The potion instantly transformed and extended into Klein's mouth, making him feel like he was devouring a dark red glow. Latest novels on novel.by/n.com. The transparent maggot swarmed back into his body, tearing down the parts of the potion and swallowing them. As his mythical creature form was special, both a full body and also separated into many small parts, Klein could only consume the potion in such a manner. Of course, if he could control his incomplete mythical creature form, it would be much simpler. Without a sound, he felt a cold feeling spread through every worm of spirit, with a searing pain. A familiar, boundless greyish-white fog appeared in front of him. It enveloped the entire world, revealing some of his past experiences. This included the terrifying legends he created, his conversation with the Red Angel evil spirit, the treatment of the demigod, Luca, with the help of Miss Justice, hunting of In Rambis, dealing with Amorn's avatars, revenge on Int Zangwil, exploring Calderon City, infiltrating St. Samuel Cathedral, dominating the seas, stopping the true creator's descent, saving Tin-Gen, and various other details of his daily life. They made conflicts with different people and things, becoming extremely complicated as they merged into a sea. As he flew through it, he was unable to find a clear and accurate sense of self. He felt like he was about to be lost in this area. The cold, burning pain constantly drove him forward so as to expel the influence on him. This made it difficult to return to the real world. With great difficulty, Klein managed to control this feeling. As he gradually lost consciousness and his body slowly descended, he tried his best to find something that could confirm his identity. Finally, he saw the deep depths of the grey fog. At the end of the sea was a shattered spot of light. With a thought, he followed his intuition and flew over in a manner that seemed to travel the cosmos. There was a figure hanging from the blurry door of light in the spot of light. He was stored in a transparent cocoon as he swayed gently. He looked like the original Ju Mingrue. This had nothing to do with his surroundings. He was alone and easily grasped. I couldn't see this before when I used the yesterday once more charm, but I can actually do so now. In other words, during the advancement process, I can indirectly influence the Sapphire castle above the grey fog. Wait, my ability to think has been restored. Klein's consciousness instantly cleared up as he finally understood the essence of the ritual. By eliminating the interference, he could provide a clear definition of himself to become a scholar of yore. This prevented him from getting lost. Following a similar spot of light, Klein began to fly deeper into the greyish-white fog. Along the way, he discovered that the surrounding fog was scattered with fragments of light. They had colonial phases, times when Roselle ruled, the Battle of the Violated Oath, the White Rose War, the 20-Year War. These were all bits of history that Klein knew of the Fifth Epoch. As he passed through them, he naturally split his consciousness and completed an invisible connection, making his definition of his own identity even clearer. In the Pale Era, during the War of the Four Emperors, the Trunsoist Empire, the Tudor Dynasty, the United Empire, Solomon's First and Second Empire, the fall of Red Angel, the Blood Emperor's apotheosis, the Black Emperor's return, and other historical fragments continued to surface as Klein kept rushing forward. They appeared in different spots in the endless grey fog, like the stars in the night sky. They illuminated the path to return. In such a manner, Klein felt that he was becoming more and more lucid. Every worm of spirit's coldness and burning sensation became milder. He could have turned around a long time ago and returned to the real world. However, he didn't stop and continued flying forward. Scenes of the fatal attack of the Rose Redemption, the three great angels, White, Storm, Wisdom sharing in the body of the ancient sun god, and the plotting in the giant king's court with the Church of Evernight, Earth, and combat hiding as secret organizations flashed across the greyish-white fog. The more he proceeded forward, the more relaxed he felt. He felt like he was about to fly up from running down a runway. At some point in time, a group of terrifying canine-like creatures with dark red eye sockets appeared beside him. They ran around the indiscernible bottom of the grey fog as they followed him by his side as if they were accompanying and guarding him. Among them, two of them only had one eye. Klein looked around and smiled. He didn't stop and continued proceeding deeper into the grey fog. The history of the Dual Era and the early era of fire swept past him from behind, pointing out the path that led forward. Finally, Klein stopped in front of a lonely fragment of light. Inside was a withered forest and a normal-sized tomb. He went forward and saw that the greyish-white fog was silently enveloping everything. It was unknown where the other fragments of light were floating. Feeling his spirituality depleting, Klein didn't continue the search. He connected his consciousness to his origin, and he suddenly plummeted. As the grey fog rapidly faded away, Klein felt his body and saw the cauldron in front of him. He didn't care about his current state, and he subconsciously looked up into the sky. He directly saw the grey fog and the ancient majestic palace above the grey fog. The mysterious space was trembling slightly. In Backland, a postman who was riding a bicycle stopped. He turned his head slightly and adjusted the monocle on his right eye. He then muttered to himself, "Sapphire Castle." After a few seconds of hesitation, the thin-faced young man curled his lips and laughed. His expression was filled with anticipation. In a rental apartment at East Borough of the same city, figures hanging in the air swayed gently. At the same time, they simultaneously made a sound. Sapphira Castle. In the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral, Leonard Mitchell, who was assigning missions to his team, suddenly heard an elderly voice in his mind. Sapphira Castle. Lord of the Mysteries, Chapter 1138. In the Highlands, on an altar with eyes, arms, heads, and organs embedded in it. Dark red blood-red light surged out like a tidal wave, distorting into the shape of a deformed tree. Amidst a buzzing sound, the human bones, candles, silver plates, and gold boxes trembled, as though they could slice through one spirit body. The surrounding supplicants instinctively bowed their heads and prostrated. Then they simultaneously came to a realization. The Berserk Sea, Reef Island. When he saw the ancient palace above the grey fog and sensed the slight tremble of the mysterious space, Klein felt that he had a deeper connection with the so-called Sapphira Castle, one that was hard to accurately grasp. At this moment, he truly felt that place would gradually belong to him. In just a few seconds, all the abnormalities disappeared. Without any delay, Klein got the two marionettes to put away the items that were still of value and destroy the rest. He took out a paper figurine and shook it. With a smacking sound, the paper figurine ignited with a scarlet flame as dense illusory wings appeared behind his back. When he saw this, Klein was stunned. He never expected that the simple paper figurine substitutes would have hints of Angel's embrace. He then grabbed Konas and Inuni, using teleport to vanish from the island formed by reefs. After using several islands in the Sonia Sea as waypoints, he took a huge DT before finally returning to his residence in Backlund's East Borough. During this process, he repeatedly used paper figurine substitutes, which had undergone several qualitative changes to disrupt divination, prophecy powers, tracking, and observation. Phew, I didn't expect it to really trigger the changes in Sapphira Castle, resulting in an unconcealable phenomenon. Fortunately, I was sufficiently careful and cautious. I wasn't careless. If I had advanced in Backlund or the surrounding areas, I'm certain that Amorn and Zaratul would have already seen me. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he hurriedly took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the grey fog to do a divination. After confirming that he was in a safe situation, he didn't stay for long. He immediately returned to the real world, and with the help of cogitation, he began to restrain his diverging spirituality. After doing this, he took off his clothes, threw himself into bed, and fell into a deep sleep. Normally, a Bizarro sorcerer wouldn't be as exhausted as he was after successfully advancing to Scholar of Yore. He would definitely have energy left to check his physical condition. However, while traveling through history, he relied on his mark to travel a very far distance. He relied on his own mastery of ancient secrets, that far exceeded his current level, to reach the establishment of the giant King's Cow UN, the early of the Second Epoch or the end of the epoch. This was equivalent to digesting the potion. After a few hours of deep sleep, Klein woke up as he slowly opened his eyes. He sat up, pulled a pillow to prop him up from behind, and rubbed his temples. After 10 minutes of regulating himself, he was completely awake and began to inspect himself. Indeed, I've digested most of the potion right after I consumed it. At least 80%. This is roughly what I expected, but I wonder how much more ancient history I'll have to obtain before I can digest it completely. From the looks of it, the acting of a Scholar of Yore has 2 main directions. One is a scholar from ancient times, and the other is a scholar who studies ancient history. Both of them are required. The first is relatively easy because the ritual itself contains the key point of making one a person from ancient times. Once the advancement is successful, one can naturally act as a scholar from ancient times. The second point is extremely difficult. It would be alright in normal society, but in this world with true gods, devils, and evil existences, just gathering ancient information is a very risky matter. If I endeavor to gather the truth of history, I might die a horrible death at any moment without any reason. The more I understand, the greater the danger. The reason why I know so much is mostly thanks to the arrangements of a few existences, as well as the complicated fate that Sapphira Castle brings me. This makes me encounter all sorts of things. Of course, even so, I've already died once despite being a true deity's blessed. What's more, other scholars of yore. Changing the spot of miracle invoker and scholar of yore will make acting relatively simple. Unfortunately, there's no such thing. In addition, the previous two meanings have an inclination towards ancient times. I have to pay attention to the word scholar. What must I figure out from history before I can be considered a scholar? Next, there are a few directions towards my digestion. First, I need to figure out Dark Angel Sasria's current state and truly replicate the actual process of the cataclysm. Second, I need to spend some effort to connect the history of the fourth epoch together, and not just be fine with having them in disconnected segments. Third, I need to go deep into the details from a macroscopic view. For example, the rise and fall of the Antigonus family. After confirming that prior acting was effective, and considering his future path ahead of time, Klein combined the mysticism knowledge he had gained from his advancement and his observation of his godhood's divinity, and he had a trial run of his powers to slowly figure out the powers of a scholar of yore. Worms of Spirit can be split into 600 pieces. The godhood patterns have also changed to a certain degree. It's even more complicated, and it can showcase concepts of strength, strangeness, and supernaturalness. The changes in my godhood patterns firstly originate from the newly obtained characteristic, and secondly, it comes from the mysticism knowledge contained within the potion. This is both a result of the Beyonder characteristic and also something obtained from a higher level. After becoming a true high-sequence Beyonder, is it possible to directly change the knowledge at a higher dimension to affect Beyonders at other sequences? Deciphering a potion formula from the godhood patterns seems like an actual example. Check for news stories on no/v/l/bin.c0m. Also, at the level of sequence 3, the changes in godhood patterns have a personal effect. This is closely related to prayer and responses. As a scholar of yore, the corresponding honorific names will be different in nature. This is because of different personalities, experiences, and traits. Yes, I can allow different worms of spirit to instinctively listen to prayers and respond to them when it's a relatively uncomplicated matter. It doesn't affect my other actions. The specially marked ones and more complicated matters will be handed over to my actual body. A scholar of yore can use a worm of spirit to act as a god, but what about other sequence 3 Beyonders from other pathways? It's impossible for them to respond while sleeping, right? I'll think of my honorific name as a scholar of yore later. I'll first study the specific abilities. A scholar of yore's main ability is to obtain help from history. This is split into two parts. One is to borrow strength from my past self. This is rather embarrassing for me. It's currently useless because the past me is definitely weaker than the present me. Yes, when I was hanging above the door of light above the grey fog, I was just an ordinary person. Compared to those who were important figures in the past but are now weak due to all kinds of reasons, this is a godly skill. One can be a baby crying for ice cream while engaging in a sequence 1 battle. It would be impossible to find any weaknesses. The only problem is that it's not long-lasting. Of course, as more time passes after I become a scholar of yore, this will begin to show its effects. I can often borrow strength from my past scholar of yourself so that I wouldn't have any moment of weakness. Even if I were to suffer serious injuries. To a certain extent, this is something that's self-perpetuating, preventing myself from ever being in a nadi until my spirituality is completely drained. Yes, before my spirituality is drained, I can always borrow energy from my past self. There's no limit to the number of times. As for my current spirituality, even without the process of recovering, I can borrow power nearly 10 times a day, maintaining it for 5 minutes each time. The second part is to summon images from the historical void. It can be humans or objects. The more detailed and the better the understanding I have of the corresponding piece of history and matters, the higher the chance of success is and the longer it will last. Similarly, the lower the target's level is, relative to me, the higher the chance of success and the longer it can be maintained. In addition, increasing my affinity with the target will increase the chances of success and the time it can be maintained. These are the 3 conditions to succeed. Furthermore, when summoning someone of a higher level than myself, or an item, even if I barely succeed, the final projection will only have a portion of the strength and quality of the original. It can't be one who's at full strength. Also, I can only maintain 3 images summoned from the historical void at any point in time, including those summoned by my marionettes. Currently, even if it's the most ordinary item or something that was once mine, I can maintain its availability for a maximum of 15 minutes. The fact that the target has a close relationship with me is worth rumination. In essence, borrowing power from one's own body is also a form of summoning. It's just that one's relationship with oneself is extremely close, so there's no possibility of failure. It's an extreme example. In other words, if I were to summon the important figures from the historical void, it would be best to establish a friendly relationship with them and maintain it for a long time. Yes, if I were to summon Mr. Azik's projection, the chances of success will definitely be higher than projecting other angels. How is this a beyond a power? This is obviously studies related to EQ, relationships, and interpersonal communication. As he sighed with emotion, Klein sincerely felt that the core powers of a scholar of yore were godly. After all, those that involved history and time were most likely extremely magical. However, in order to put it to use to its fullest potential, one had to have sufficient intelligence and also make the necessary preparations. This was an unchanging requirement of the seer pathway. Yes, when summoning images from the historical void, there's no way to communicate with them. That is to say that a scholar of yore can't interfere with history and change the past. From the angle of acting, this can be summarized as witnessing fate, affecting the present, and the inability to reverse the past. Apart from the ability to transfer a certain part of ailments, wounds, curses, attacks, prophecies, and observations to paper figurine substitutes, there's another power. It can transfer a certain part to the target. Before one discovers that it's fake, things can continue proceeding as per normal. If anyone loses their heart while their brain remains active, I can give them a paper heart for a short period of time. He will be able to obtain strength from history to beat and circulate blood. The time it takes to attain initial control of spirit body threads has shortened to 2 seconds, and completely transforming into a marionette takes 10 seconds. The maximum range for the 2 is 500 meters. By controlling a marionette, the limit to swapping positions is 5 kilometers. Flame jump is also 5 kilometers. I can freely control the might of air cannon, and at its maximum might, it's equivalent to a coastal defensive cannon. A creature that can transform into a physical form whose characteristics have a difference that does not exceed a certain level. Some of the organs created can be used, while others are only decorations. Phew, this is a scholar of yore who has digested most of the potion. After examining himself, Klein slowly stood up. He planned on entering the world above the grey fog to check on the changes in Sapphira Castle. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1139. Above the endless greyish-white fog, Klein's figure appeared in the ancient palace. He only looked around briefly, and he realized that there were a few changes. The most obvious point was that the state of the mysterious space and its layout had been fully projected into his spirit body. Even at a great distance, he could still see the greyish-white clouds and that strange door of light. Apart from the palace that I conjured and the door of light that originally existed, there's nothing here. It's empty, boundless, and full of power of a high level. As he murmured, he sat down, raised his right hand, and gently lifted it up. In the blink of an eye, the entire grey fog boiled. The mysterious space it carried quaked as beams of slightly dark light emitted. When the light gathered together, it condensed into a translucent angel with illusory wings on its back, as per Klein's will. It had the same level and power as an angel. It was majestic and sacred, with an oppressive aura. There's no need to add the Black Emperor card, the Tyrant card, or the Red Priest card. There's no need to use the Sea God Scepter either. With my power alone, I can stir most of the powers of this mysterious space to its fullest potential, allowing the Fool's Angel to become a true Sequence 2 angel. Of course, this angel is unable to respond to prayers or be maintained for too long. It only exists in the embrace form and within a few attacks, having some powers in the domain of miracles. Indeed, being able to revive is a gift from Sapphira Castle. As for how many more times I can be resurrected, I can't come to a conclusion now. If I can obtain a grade 0 sealed artifact and use its level to observe it, I should be able to see it more clearly. I'll just treat it as one more time. It's not a bad thing to while being cautious. This reminds me to be careful and cautious. This is the way for Beyonders of the seer pathway to survive. Unfortunately, this miracle can only be used for myself for now. Yes, at most, in order to truly possess and control this mysterious space, I have to become an angel or even a sequence 1 angel at least. It lives up to its name as Sapphira Castle. As for that strange door of light, its requirements are even higher. It's impossible to tell if there are any hidden dangers at the moment. What's the meaning of the existence of Sapphira Castle? Baiting transmigrators to revive the original creator? With a flick of his right hand, the holy and powerful angel dissipated in midair. The entire Sapphira Castle calmed down. Following that, Klein stood up and took a step towards the greyish-white cloud in midair. He stood in front of the strange door of light formed from countless spherical lights. The door of light was tainted with some bluish-black color. Each spherical light's essence was a transparent and translucent worm that formed into a ball. As he stared at the transparent cocoons hanging by the black threads, Klein extended his right hand and slowly reached out to the door of light in an attempt to touch it. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. His hand finally touched the edge of the door of light, but it passed right through as if it was just an illusion. However, compared to his previous attempt, the illusory door of light was clearly a little stickier, as though it was about to turn corporeal. This is an item that represents the essence of Sapphira Castle. After pondering for a few seconds, he turned and returned to the ancient palace. Without any delay, he left the world above the grey fog and began experimenting with the various powers he had just acquired. I have to first get an honorific name. The prayer response range for a sequence 3 Beyonder is a region. This range is different depending on the authority that one wields. Clearly, a Sea King's range is a relatively far-reaching type. Therefore, this honorific name of mine also has its limits. The protector of all the poor children in Backland? It feels odd. Yes, other people might have a limitation, but it's not necessarily the case for me. I can use the spirit world and the blessed of Sapphira Castle as a replacement. I should be the only one who is blessed in both regions. It's unique enough. This way, as long as someone is in the same city or district as me, they can use this honorific name to pray to me. There's nothing I can do if we're not in the same area. I can't possibly do the same as throwing the sea god scepter above the grey fog, splitting a few wounds of spirit to the world above the grey fog, and using Sapphira Castle's level to respond throughout the entire world. Although I can't confirm the relationship between the Dark Angel and the ancient Sun God, this is enough to remind me to be careful with my avatars and marionettes. Also, it's not as simple as splitting a few worms. A large number of worms of spirit have to be left in Sapphira Castle to achieve the desired effect. I'm currently unable to do that. Right, my mental state isn't too bad. I don't have a dissociative disorder, nor do I have the irresistible urge to become cold and terrifying. This means that the mark of a scholar of yore in history is his anchor. Also, the Emperor's situation worsened only after he became an angel, causing him to have no choice but to rely on his believers as anchors to anchor him in place. I'm still one huge level away. I need to find out what else can be used as anchors, apart from believers, to ensure that nothing goes wrong. Amidst his thoughts, Klein picked up pen and paper. He wrote the first line of his honorific name. The blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle. After some thought, he began writing the second and third lines based on his rich experience and knowledge he got from his Godhead patterns. The mystery stemming from ancient times. The witness of an extended history. Since a sequence 3 Beyonder wasn't a true deity, he couldn't use a 3-line description. After some thought, he added 2 more lines. protector of magic and drama performers. The Great German Sparrow. In fact, non-true deities could also use three-line descriptions, but one of them had to rely on the level of a true god. For example, Klein could use blessed of the Evernight goddess. Under such circumstances, it was essentially similar to a type of summoning incantation, not an honorific name for prayers, similar to that of messengers. And if the messenger was a spirit world creature, the restriction of being the blessed of a particular true deity was unnecessary. Therefore, it was often unknown what would be summoned, making it rather dangerous. After repeatedly deliberating for a while, Klein controlled his marionette, Inuni, and recited the honorific name in ancient Hermes. A few seconds later, Klein raised his right hand and rubbed his temples with an odd expression. He didn't hear the prayer. What's wrong with this honorific name? Klein carefully deliberated over it a few times and gradually came up with an idea. I might not be the only blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle. The hounds of Fulgrim also count. I have to add a limitation. After some modifications, Inuni once again recited in ancient Hermes, the blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle. The mystery stemming from ancient times. The witness of an extended history. Protector of Backland magic and drama performers. The Great German Sparrow. I pray for your blessings. I hope you can light up the darkness in front of me. Just as Inuni's voice faded, Klein heard his prayer. Furthermore, it was only heard by a few worms of spirit. It didn't affect his actual body at all. This is very different from the prayer coming from Sapphira Castle. It's very clear. With a thought, his worm of spirit gave a response based on the rules he had made ahead of time. With a whoosh, a ball of fire appeared in front of Inuni. It floated in midair, illuminating the entire room. Not bad. If I use Hermes to pray, I have to set up a ritual and draw symbols. As for essential oils and herbs, it doesn't matter if they're provided or not. Am I someone who will be pleased by these things? The symbols are formed from the scrolls representing history, the complete eye that represents witness, and the line symbolizing change. For the time being, Klein had no intention of spreading his honorific name. After all, letting others know that German Sparrow had reached sequence 3 would be a case of him losing a trump card. Furthermore, he had the alternate identity as Sea God and the Fool. There was no need for a new honorific name. Pa. With a snap of his fingers, he lit the paper with the honorific name of German Sparrow on the table. A scholar of you also has the means to create a fog to lower the temperature, but it's not a core power. Next, I have to try to summon a projection from the historical void. Who shall be my first volunteer? As he muttered silently to himself, Klein suddenly sighed. He then half closed his eyes and used his guard to allow a portion of his spirit to enter the grey fog and roam amidst history. Following the various locations that he had previously established, he instantly arrived in front of a spot made of light. There was a spacious and bright room with 2 rows of floor-to-ceiling windows in the spot of light. In the room, a man wearing a dark red coat embroidered with golden lines was standing by the window, looking at the place where the sun had set. He looked to be in his 30s, with long chestnut curly hair, blue eyes, high nose bridge, and thin lips. He had a neat mustache and looked rather good. Roselle Gustav. In a street in Northborough, a thin-faced young man with a wide forehead and a monocle was sitting in a coffee shop by the side of the road. He held a fountain pen and thought seriously. He raised his other hand and pinched his monocle. Finally, he wrote down a sentence. The blessed of the spirit world and Sapphira Castle. Then, the fountain pen stopped moving, as if he had not thought of what to write next. Check for news stories on no/v/l/bin.c0m. In a rented 2-bedroom apartment at East Borough, Klein took out his golden pocket watch and opened it. He had already made an appointment with Miss Sharon and Marie to meet in an uninhabited house tonight. After some thought, he raised his right hand and grabbed at the space in front of him. A simple, ancient brass key appeared in his palm. This was the master key that had once helped him defeat Wraith Steve and prevent the true creator from descending. It allowed one to hear Mr. Dawes' ravings on the night of the full moon. Now, by summoning it back from the historical void, it could be used for 10 minutes. To a scholar of yore, anything that they once possessed, regardless if they were eventually sold, returned, destroyed, or lost for all sorts of reasons, can never really be considered lost. They just exist alongside the scholar of yore in a different form of companionship. Looking at the master key in his hand, Klein sighed in satisfaction. With this item, if he could grasp the corresponding ritual, he could directly speak to Mr. Daw as well. After putting away the master key, he put on his double-breasted frock coat and silk top hat, picked up his golden cane, and walked out of the room. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1140. Backland, Eastborough, 7 Pinster Street. After a busy day, Leonard finally had the chance to ask his questions. "Old man, what is Sapphira Castle?" The slightly aged voice in his mind fell silent for a few seconds. He chuckled and said, "The place where you meet every Monday is most likely Sapphira Castle." Leonard never expected to hear such an answer. His mind went blank for a moment. He was surprised, shocked, and confused, mixed together with the thoughts of it being impossible for to pop out of nowhere and the poignant feelings of how complicated things were. After a while, he pressed in a low voice, "What kind of place is Sapphira Castle?" As though sighing and laughing self-deprecatingly, Palace Zoroast said, "Actually, I'm not too sure. I've only heard some rumors. It's different from the creation myth, you know. Rumor has it that the original creator left behind 9 different entities. They were kingdoms, cities, rivers, oceans, and keys. Sapphira Castle was one of them. It might not actually be a castle, but something else. As for what its exact form is, you might know it better than me. The reason why I'm certain of its existence is because I sensed it when I became an angel, but I was unable to see it and establish a connection with it. My great-grandfather mentioned a theory that the 9 entities might have something to do with the Sephro of the second blasphemy slate. Unfortunately, because of various reasons, he was unable to decipher the details related to the Sephro." Leonard calmed down. Leaning back against the sofa, he asked thoughtfully, "Old man, do you suspect that Mr. Fool is the embodiment of Sephro?" Based on what he had seen and heard from the Tarot Club and Old Man's occasional lecture, he had a certain understanding of matters regarding the deities. After a long silence, Palace Zoroast replied, "Perhaps." Under the strict curfew at night, there were almost no pedestrians on the streets of Backland. Occasionally, there would be carriages passing by, carrying people of status. After arriving at the agreed-upon house, Klein wasn't in a hurry to enter. He half closed his eyes, raised his right hand, and grabbed at something in front of him. He pulled out another Sherlock Moriarty wearing a black double-breasted frock coat and a silk half-top hat while holding a golden-laid cane. This was the image of him from the historical void when he left his residence earlier. As Klein was right in front of him, this image appeared stiff, like a prop on stage. According to his previous experiments, Klein knew that this was the mysticism principle of a unique shared consciousness in time. To put it simply, everyone was essentially unique. If one's true body remained sentient, the projection wouldn't remain sentient. It was the same when summoning projections of the deceased from the historical void, a result Klein suspected to be attributed to his insufficient level. In short, his projections could only engage in more mechanical and instinctive battles. Something that was unknown to the scholars of yore had prevented them from giving a corresponding answer even if they experienced it for themselves. This confirmed one of Klein's guesses. Those fragments a scholar of yore could see in the historical fog was something he had learned in real life and had studied. Simply put, the fog needed a scholar of yore to light it up, bit by bit. Of course, Klein also suspected that if the historical fragments of the same matter had been mostly lit up, the rest would very likely be presented naturally. At least the corresponding ability won't be lost just because I don't understand it well enough. As long as there's a projection in the historical void, that state will be a complete snapshot. That's enough. Klein looked at the projection that could only act on instinct. His body suddenly vanished and entered the greyish-white fog. Since hounds of Fulgrim, who weren't full scholars of yore, could live in the historical void, there was no reason that a true scholar of yore couldn't. The only problem was that there was a time limit. In addition, if time dragged on, the marionettes in the real world would definitely die. However, this was only changing the form of companionship it had with a scholar of yore. As Klein's body entered the greyish-white fog, his consciousness suddenly came alive in the projection. He raised his hand and pressed down on his top hat. Wearing the face of Sherlock Moretti, he came outside of the house. Following their agreement, he took out the master key and placed it against the door, turning it gently. His figure appeared in the room, and under the crimson moonlight, he quickly surveyed his surroundings. The sofas, cupboards, high-backed chairs, coffee tables, and other furniture were evidently old. They seemed to come from the previous century. In the dark environment, in a Gothic regal dress and a matching bonnet, Sharon suddenly appeared on a high-backed chair. "Good evening," this puppet lady nodded slightly and greeted him. If she hadn't spoken, she would be a classic and most exquisite doll. At the same time, Marie, who was wearing a white shirt and black vest, also phased into existence on the sofa. "Sir, it's already winter. Aren't you cold wearing just this?" "Ah, right, you're dead, one who isn't afraid of the cold." After lampooning inwardly, Klein took off his hat and bowed at the blonde, blue-eyed, pale-faced Sharon. "Good evening, Miss Sharon." He then turned around and said to Marie, "Good evening." To this wraith who was formerly a zombie, the deepest impression Klein had of him was his card game with the zombies he controlled. "We should play cards when we have the time." He sighed silently. The reason why he suddenly thought of playing cards was because he had previously analyzed the combat styles of Scholar of Yore, and he realized that if he were to encounter Zaratul, both sides would very likely end up playing a card game. You throw a Consul Roselle card, I'll throw an Emperor Roselle card. You throw a Bernadette card, I'll throw a Benora. If you throw the half-fool card, I'll match it with a Morn. I didn't expect that the battle between a seer would one day become playing cards. It's a realistic, abnormally harrowing game of cards. Sigh, but Zaratul is a Sequence 1 angel, and he wouldn't give me a chance to play cards. Besides, my success rate at summoning the important figures in the historical void is rather low. Klein retracted his gaze and took the initiative to say to Sharon, "I've recently needed to do something. It's rather difficult and dangerous. One of the steps is to collect Beyonder blood from the 22 different pathways. As for the Wraith pathway, the only person I can ask for help is you and Marie. You should be skilled at hexes, and you should have a way to remove the connection between your blood and yourself." In fact, he could have attempted to summon Admiral of Blood Senior on the spot and mix his blood into the porcelain jar. However, he didn't know if it would be effective, nor could he divine it. After all, this involved a level that exceeded Sequence 1, and he lacked information. The only thing he could confirm was that drawing that symbol didn't bring him and the suppliers any danger. Due to the fact that a Scholar of Yore had many means at their disposal, he had even tried to summon the former witch Trissy. He easily subdued her and smeared her blood onto Groselle's travels. However, it was useless. After some thought, Klein believed that a logical contradiction on the timeline had happened, preventing him from success. That blood was formerly provided by Trissy of the past. The person Groselle's travels pulled in would undoubtedly be the former Trissy, so it was equivalent to changing history. Since history couldn't be changed, the experiment failed. After listening to Sherlock Moriarty's request quietly, Sharon said without any change in expression, "Okay. How much do you want?" Miss Sharon's reaction is exactly as I imagined. Klein took out a glass tube. One tube would suffice. Dressed in a Gothic regal dress, Sharon raised her right hand slightly. The glass tube seemed to possess a life of its own as it left Klein's palm and flew over. Right on the heels of that, the doll-like lady's right hand landed on her left wrist. Her nails suddenly grew long and became unusually sharp. With just a light stroke, a wound opened up at her wrist. Blood seeped out, but it didn't drip down. Instead, it floated up and entered the glass tube. By the time the tube was filled, Sharon's wound had healed instantly, leaving no scar behind. The stopper jumped into the tube and spun a few times to automatically seal the tube. During this process, the pale-faced Sharon wore an impassive expression, as if she had suppressed all the feelings in her heart. Looking at the tube of blood in her hand, Sharon reached out with her left hand and touched it, slowly sliding from top to bottom. This was done to remove her connection to the blood. Check for news stories on no/v/l/bin.c0m. After doing all of this, the blood tube leaped up and flew back into Klein's hands. Is there anything else I can help you with? Sharon sat on a high-backed chair and said calmly. Not for now. Thank you. Klein shook his head and snapped his fingers, igniting a scarlet flame in his palm. The flame quickly rose and enveloped the glass tube. By the time the redness dissipated, the blood was gone. This was a new change and flaming jump. It could transfer the items on him to his marionette or body. Apart from this, all sorts of beyonder powers from before had been enhanced and modified. Having used his new powers skillfully, he looked at Sharon and asked casually, "How's the digestion of your puppet potion?" When he first met Miss Sharon, he felt that she was like a doll. He believed that, regardless of her nature, or it being a result of the temperance principle, it would have been a form of prior acting. It would be of great help to the digestion of the puppet potion. Not bad, Sharon replied calmly. I should be able to digest everything in another 1 to 2 years. 1 to 2 years. Indeed, no matter how fast it is, it's counted in years. But for me, it's been less than half a year. This isn't something to be proud of. It was all arranged. Of course, if you count the time I was hung above the door of light, it's counted in millennia. Miracle invoker. If I can escape this fate, I might be able to create a miracle. Klein sighed inwardly and gently nodded. What are your plans for the time being? Sharon said, I hope to restore Teacher's body. Marie, who was sitting on the sofa, added, but didn't you say that the leader of the secret order, Zaratul, is in Backland and is closely related to the Rose School of Thought? Yes, Klein said with a smile. Wait patiently. There will be a chance. This was actually a form of consolation. Even though he had become a scholar of yore and had found many helpers, he had no intention of dealing with Zaratul at the moment. A sequence 1 in full would definitely be unimaginably terrifying. Furthermore, the more he exposed himself to the path of Seer, the more Klein could understand how terrifying and difficult it was to kill Zaratul. After stopping George Ill's apotheosis, Klein planned on leaving Backland and giving himself more time to grow.